"You are not worthy to sit with this family," my mother whispered, her arm rigidly blocking the heavy mahogany doors of my own brother's wedding. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply lowered my eyes, turned around, and walked away in silence. She smiled fully, believing she had won. She thought I was going to drive back to my cramped studio apartment and weep over my own inadequacy. But hours later, the soaring music of the string quartet stopped dead mid-note. The room full of wealthy, impeccably dressed guests froze in absolute horror. And my brother finally learned exactly why his only sister had been kept outside in the parking lot. What my mother did not know, what she could never have anticipated in her wildest dreams, was that the bride knew my secret. My name is Maya Evans. I am 28 years old and I work 60-hour weeks as a medical billing specialist. I am the girl who fixes the numbers. I spend my days navigating complex insurance denials, arguing with hospital administrators, and making sure the math always adds up for strangers, while my own family's financial reality was built on a foundation of lies. In my family, my job description was entirely different. I was the human shock absorber. I absorbed the financial stress, the unpaid utility bills, and the overwhelming shame so my parents could seamlessly maintain their perfect upper-middle-class suburban illusion. For years, I played my assigned role flawlessly. I wore the cheap clearance rack clothes. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with a rattling engine. I stayed quietly in the shadows so my older brother Lucas, the golden child of the Evans family, could bask in the spotlight. I genuinely believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I sacrificed enough of my own youth and sanity, they would eventually love me. I was foolishly wrong. Love in the Evans household was never unconditional. It was a calculated transaction, and my mother, Brenda, was the chief accountant. I learned early on that my worth was measured entirely by my utility. When the mortgage was late, I was the reliable daughter who emptied her meager savings account. When the country club membership dues threatened to bounce, I was the one who quietly picked up an extra weekend shift at the clinic. I convinced myself this was just what families did for one another. I swallowed the bitter pill of my own invisibility, telling myself that one day my loyalty would be recognized. But loyalty to people who view you as an appliance only guarantees that you will eventually burn out. And the ultimate reward for my silent, desperate devotion was not gratitude. It was a calculated attempt to completely destroy my future. Starting on the day of the most important social event my parents had ever hosted, the air at the Oakmont Country Club smelled of crushed peonies, white roses, and old money. The club was a sprawling estate with manicured golf courses and towering oak trees that had stood for a century. It was the kind of modern suburban estate that demanded perfection from everyone who walked through its gilded front doors. Valets in crisp white shirts hurried to park a continuous stream of luxury vehicles. I pulled my rattling sedan into a spot near the back edge of the lot, far out of sight. I stepped out, smoothing down the front of my modest navy blue dress. It was simple, bought on clearance, but I had ironed it carefully. In my hands, I held a beautifully wrapped gift for the newlyweds. I took a deep breath, trying to push down the familiar knot of anxiety that always tightened in my chest whenever I was around my family. Today was about Lucas. I told myself to just blend in, sit in the back, and be happy for my brother. I walked up the sweeping stone staircase and entered the grand foyer. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors. A soft murmur of elegant conversation drifted from the main hall. And then I saw her. My mother, Brenda, detached herself from a group of guests and marched directly toward me. She wore a custom-tailored silver gown that probably cost more than my rent for 6 months. Her hair was perfectly styled by a professional she had undoubtedly tipped with money she did not actually have. Her diamonds caught the light, but her eyes were completely devoid of warmth. They raked over my simple dress, my sensible shoes, and my unstyled hair with visceral, undisguised disgust. Before I could even offer a greeting, she stepped directly into my path. She planted her feet firmly, her body forming a physical blockade between me and the heavy mahogany double doors leading to the ceremony space. "What exactly are you doing here?" she hissed. Her voice was pitched incredibly low, a venomous whisper designed to evade the ears of the passing guests. I blinked, tightening my grip on the gift. "I am here for the wedding, Mom. I am his sister." Brenda let out a short, breathless scoff. "Do not call me that in here. Look at yourself, Maya. Look at this room. Then look at you. Your presence completely ruins the aesthetic we have worked so hard to build. Lucas is marrying into a significant family today. We are merging with real wealth, real prestige. You showing up looking like a tired, overworked secretary is a glaring reminder of the struggle we are trying to leave behind." My heart slammed against my ribs. The cruelty of her words sliced through me like physical blows. But I had bought the dress specifically to blend in. I had stayed out of the bridal party. I had done everything she had ever asked of me. "I will just sit in the back." I pleaded softly, hating how desperate my own voice sounded. I will not talk to anyone. I just want to see Lucas get married. Absolutely not. Brenda snapped, taking another step forward to force me back toward the exit. You do not understand how important today is. Jasmine's family is attending. Her father is a major player in commercial real estate. Her aunts and uncles are executives. If they see you, if they ask you what you do for a living, you will humiliate us. You will expose everything. You are a walking liability, Maya. I need you to leave this premises right now before the bride's family sees you. I looked past her shoulder, catching a glimpse of the beautiful floral arches inside the ceremony room. For 28 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into the tiny, dark corners my mother assigned to me. I had paid her bills. I had kept her secrets. And standing here in this opulent foyer, being treated like a disease that needed to be quarantined, I finally realized the agonizing truth. I was never going to be enough. So I played the exact role she expected. I let my shoulders slump. I lowered my head, staring at the polished marble floor. I am sorry, I whispered. I am sorry for ruining the aesthetic. I turned around slowly, my posture radiating complete defeat. I walked back toward the glass exit doors, feeling Brenda's victorious gaze burning into my spine. I played the broken obedient, worthless scapegoat flawlessly. She thought she had broken me. She thought I was retreating in tears. Every step I took toward the exit felt incredibly heavy. The cheerful sounds of the arriving guests faded into a dull ringing in my ears. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and the warm afternoon air hit my face. The valet attendant glanced at me with a flicker of pity, clearly recognizing someone who did not belong among the Mercedes and the Lexuses. I kept my head down, forcing myself to walk at a slow, defeated pace. I knew Brenda was likely watching me from the foyer window, ensuring her problem was truly being eliminated from the premises. I had to make the performance convincing. I let out a shaky breath, mimicking a sob, and quickly wiped my dry eyes as if brushing away tears. My mind raced back to all the moments that had led to this exact expulsion. All the times I had been shoved into the background. It was brilliant, really, how Brenda managed to twist her own failures into my shortcomings. She was so convinced of my weakness that she never once suspected I might finally strike back. She operated on the absolute certainty that I would always be the quiet, dependable Maya who took the punishment and walked away. I reached the far corner of the parking lot and unlocked my old rattling sedan. The metal door creaked loudly as I pulled it open. I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door. The moment the latch clicked into place, closing me off from the outside world, my entire demeanor changed. My slumped shoulders straightened. The facade of the heartbroken daughter vanished entirely. I did not shed a single tear. I did not start the engine. I did not drive away. Instead, I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. The adrenaline pumping through my veins was not born of fear, but of pure, crystalline focus. A notification illuminated the screen in the dim light of the car interior. It was a text message from a number saved under a discreet alias. But I knew exactly who it was. The message was from Jasmine, the bride. Jasmine was a force of nature. She carried herself with the effortless grace of someone who never had to prove her value to anyone. She was a brilliant, stunning African-American corporate auditor. Her family did not just have the appearance of wealth, they possessed generational, quietly powerful real estate wealth. They did not need to wear flashy designer gowns to prove their worth. Jasmine had a mind like a steel trap. She dismantled corporate ledgers for a living, hunting down discrepancies, uncovering hidden offshore accounts, and exposing financial lies with ruthless efficiency in the corporate world. She was the absolute last person my mother should have ever tried to manipulate. I opened the message. The text was short and sharp. Did she take the bait? Are you in position? Let us burn this facade to the ground. I stared at the glowing words, a profound sense of vindication washing over me. For weeks, we had meticulously planned this exact scenario. We knew Brenda could not resist the urge to banish me. We knew her vanity would override her basic caution. She was so blinded by her desire to impress Jasmine's family that she completely failed to realize she was walking directly into a snare built by the bride herself. I tapped the screen and typed my reply. I am ready. I hit send. Through the open windows of my car, the delicate sweeping notes of the string quartet drifted across the manicured lawns. The ceremony was beginning. My mother was taking her seat in the front row, completely oblivious to the impending explosion. I leaned back against my worn fabric seat, listening to the music, letting the tension build in the quiet of the parking lot. The narrative of my life was no longer being written by my parents. To understand how the quiet medical biller and the wealthy corporate auditor joined forces to execute the ultimate reckoning we have. To go back to the moment the illusion cracked. We have to go back to the escalating crisis that forced Jasmine and me to build this inescapable trap. The leather steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan burned against my palms. I sat parked in the far corner of the Oakmont Country Club lot, with the engine off and the windows rolled down. The faint sweeping melody of the string quartet drifted across the manicured lawns. They were playing a classical arrangement of a modern pop song. It was the exact song my mother Brenda had bragged about selecting to impress Jasmine's wealthy relatives. I stared at the grand entrance in the distance, watching the valets jog back and forth in their crisp white shirts. My chest felt tight. Every breath I drew was thick with the suffocating humidity of the late afternoon and the massive weight of what I was about to do. I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles turned white, waiting for Jasmine to send the final signal. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed to stay calm, but my mind was spinning backward, dragging me down into the dark, suffocating reality I had lived in for the past 10 years. To the outside world, the Evans family was the picture of suburban success. We lived in a sprawling 5-bedroom house with a perfectly manicured lawn and a dramatic sweeping staircase in the foyer. But that house was a tomb. It was a spectacular, fragile glass house built on a foundation of absolute financial terror. 10 years ago, my father Richard lost his commercial supply business. The market shifted, he made terrible investments, and the company completely collapsed. He lost everything. Any rational family would have sold the massive house, downgraded their cars, and adjusted to a new reality. But rational thought did not exist in Brenda and Richard Evans' vocabulary. They were entirely consumed by their image. The thought of their neighbors finding out they were broke was a fate worse than death. So they lied. They maxed out credit cards to pay other credit cards. They took out predatory loans to keep up the appearance of wealth. And they recruited me to carry the secret. They hid the entire financial disaster from my older brother Lucas. Lucas was 20 at the time, away at an expensive private university that my parents could no longer afford. But they kept paying his tuition. Lucas was the golden child. He was handsome, athletic, and completely oblivious. He possessed that easy, careless confidence that only comes from a lifetime of being shielded from every real consequence. While the bank was calling our home phone 10 times a day threatening foreclosure, my mother was taking Lucas shopping for designer suits. She told him the business was thriving. She told him he was destined for greatness. He drove a brand new car and spent his summers vacationing with friends, never once wondering how his lifestyle was being funded. He lived in a completely different reality. He was the star of the family, the one they believed would eventually marry into high society and elevate our status. I was just the invisible machinery operating in the dark to make sure his stage never collapsed. When I turned 18, I did not get a car. I did not get a graduation party. I did not even get a celebratory dinner. I got a full-time job. I became a medical billing specialist because the shifts were grueling enough to offer unlimited overtime. While Lucas was attending frat parties and networking with the sons of executives, I was sitting in a windowless cubicle under buzzing fluorescent lights staring at dual monitors until my vision literally blurred. I learned the brutal, unforgiving language of the American healthcare system. I spent my days fighting insurance companies over complex claim denials and spending hours on hold with hostile hospital administrators. The work was mind-numbing and physically draining. I worked 60-hour weeks without hesitation. I took every available night shift, every weekend shift, and every holiday shift. I ate cheap instant noodles in the bleak staff break room while my coworkers went out for lunch. I bought all my clothes from the clearance racks of discount stores. I did not do this to save for my own college education or to build a safety net for my future. I did it to keep my parents from drowning in the ocean of debt they had created. Every single Friday morning, my direct deposit would hit my meager bank account. And every single Friday evening, my mother would be waiting for me in the kitchen with a neatly stacked pile of final notice bills. I paid the exorbitant property taxes so the county would not seize their sprawling suburban estate. I paid the massive utility bills so the crystal chandeliers would stay on when Lucas came home to visit for the holidays. I paid the minimum balances on my father's secret high-interest credit cards so the aggressive debt collectors would finally stop calling our home phone during dinner. I handed over thousands upon thousands of dollars month after month, year after grueling year. I literally watched my 20s evaporate into a massive spreadsheet of my parents' financial mistakes. My spine constantly ached from sitting hunched over a plastic keyboard for 12 hours a day. My head pounded with chronic, relentless migraines from the sheer terrifying stress of carrying the entire financial weight of 3 adults on my shoulders. I was utterly and completely exhausted to my very core. But I never stopped paying. I never walked away because I was desperate for their love. I operated under the tragic delusion that if I just proved my ultimate utility, they would finally see me. I thought that by saving their home, I would earn a permanent place inside it. I believed that every property tax bill I covered was a down payment on my mother's affection. Whenever I handed over my hard-earned money, Brenda would offer me a tight, fleeting smile. She would say, "We rely on you, Maya. You are so practical. So helpful." I clung to the word helpful like it was a lifeline. I equated being used with being valued. I convinced myself that keeping their secrets and funding their illusion was a noble sacrifice. I did not realize I was willingly walking onto an altar they had built exclusively to sacrifice me. I shifted in the driver's seat of my car, feeling the sticky heat radiating through the windshield. I looked down at my simple navy blue dress. It was modest, unwrinkled, and completely appropriate for a wedding guest. But to my mother, it was a glaring, unacceptable reminder of the poverty she was trying to hide from the wealthy family Lucas was marrying into. I had spent 10 years keeping her out of bankruptcy court. I had surrendered my entire youth to ensure she could stand in that country club today, dripping in fake jewels and projecting the illusion of old money. And her gratitude was to banish me to the parking lot. She looked me in the eye and told me I was not worthy to sit among them. She threw me away the exact moment she believed my usefulness had expired. But she had no idea what was coming next. The fragile ecosystem of our family's finances completely imploded the day Lucas announced his engagement. He had been dating Jasmine for a little over a year, and anyone with eyes could see she was completely out of our league. Jasmine was an extraordinary woman. She was a fiercely intelligent African-American corporate auditor who navigated ruthless boardrooms with the exact same effortless grace she brought to our tense family dinners. Her family was exactly what my mother Brenda had spent decades pretending to be. Jasmine's parents owned a highly successful commercial real estate development firm in Chicago. They possessed generational wealth that did not need to be announced loudly because it spoke for itself in their quiet confidence, their impeccable taste, and their genuine generosity. When Lucas brought Jasmine and her parents to our sprawling suburban house for the first official meeting, Brenda went into an absolute manic overdrive. She was utterly terrified of being exposed as a fraud. She maxed out yet another secret high-interest credit card just to hire a private chef and rent antique silver service for the evening. I spent the entire afternoon trapped in the kitchen, desperately trying to plate expensive hors d'oeuvres while my mother paced the hardwood floors, breathing heavily and constantly adjusting her fake designer jewelry. During the dinner, Jasmine's father casually and graciously mentioned that they would be covering the entire cost of the wedding reception at the exclusive Oakmont Country Club. Brenda's eyes widened with a toxic mixture of immense greed and suffocating insecurity. The thought of Jasmine's family holding all the financial power and the resulting social glory was completely unacceptable to her. She immediately slammed her wine glass down on the table and proclaimed that the Evans family would host a rehearsal dinner of equal grandeur. She promised a lavish 100-guest event at the most exclusive rooftop venue downtown. She smiled brightly at Jasmine's parents, boasting loudly about our deep family legacy and our vast resources. I stood frozen in this kitchen doorway, holding a heavy silver tray of appetizers, and felt all the blood drain completely out of my face. I knew the exact balance of my parents' bank accounts because I managed them. I knew there was absolutely nothing left. The charade had reached a catastrophic new height. Brenda was no longer just maintaining a suburban illusion for the nosy neighbors. She was actively trying to con a family of seasoned real estate tycoons into believing we were their financial equals. And I knew with terrifying certainty exactly whose future she was going to sacrifice to pay for it. The escalating demands began the very next morning. Brenda started booking high-end florists, hiring luxury event planners, and reserving a premium venue that demanded a massive upfront cash deposit. For 2 agonizing weeks, my phone rang incessantly with her urgent, frantic commands. She needed me to cover a florist deposit here and a catering fee there. I scraped the very bottom of my checking account, living on peanut butter and tap water just to keep her from throwing a hysterical screaming fit. But it was not enough. It was never enough. The true nightmare arrived on a cold, rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting at the tiny, wobbly table in my cramped one-bedroom apartment. My apartment was a bleak, windowless box located directly above a noisy 24-hour laundromat. It smelled faintly of industrial bleach and damp carpet. It was the absolute best living situation I could afford after handing over 80% of my medical billing salary every month to keep my parents from being violently evicted from their mansion. I was hunched over my glowing laptop screen, calculating how I could possibly afford basic groceries for the week when a sharp, aggressive knock echoed through the thin, hollow door. It was Brenda. She pushed past me without a single word of greeting. She did not take off her expensive wool coat. She did not look around at my dismal living conditions with even a microscopic trace of maternal concern. She simply marched into the center of my tiny living room, clutching a pristine leather folder. She dropped the folder right on top of my careful budget spreadsheets. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and delivered her ultimate command. She told me the rehearsal dinner cost had ballooned far beyond her initial estimates. The luxury venue required a final payment, the gourmet caterers were threatening to cancel the menu, and the custom floral arrangements needed immediate funding. She looked me dead in the eye and demanded that I go to my bank the very next morning and take out a $30,000 personal loan. $30,000. The massive number hung in the damp air of my apartment like a physical crushing weight. I stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the demand. I asked her how she could possibly expect me to do that. I told her my salary barely covered my own rent and the massive property taxes I was already paying for their house. Brenda simply waved her manicured hand, dismissing my genuine financial terror as if it were a minor childish inconvenience. She boldly stated that my credit score was excellent specifically because I lived such a pathetic small life with no real assets. She told me it was my fundamental duty as an Evans to secure this money for my brother. She insisted that if Jasmine's family found out we could not afford the rehearsal dinner, Lucas would be forever humiliated. The magnificent wedding would be ruined. She leaned over my cheap plastic table, her heavy diamond earrings swinging, and told me that this was the most important moment of my brother's entire life. She handed me the leather folder revealing pre-filled loan application forms she had printed out herself. She demanded that I stop being incredibly selfish and do what was necessary to protect the prestigious family reputation. I looked at the thick stack of loan papers. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. And in that precise moment, the thick, heavy fog of manipulation that had clouded my mind for 10 long years finally began to lift. I saw her not as a desperate mother trying to provide for her son, but as a ruthless parasite preparing to consume the very last drop of my future. If I walked into a bank and took out that massive unsecured loan, I would be drowning in high-interest debt for the next 15 years. I would never own a home. I would never build a savings account. I would never be able to escape this cycle of poverty. I would be entirely and permanently destroyed just so Brenda could drink expensive champagne and pretend she belonged among the wealthy elite. A strange, incredibly powerful sensation started in the very center of my chest and radiated outward through my exhausted limbs. It was the physical sensation of a massive, heavy boundary finally snapping permanently into place. My hands completely stopped shaking. My rapid breathing slowed down to a calm, steady rhythm. I stood up from my wobbly chair and looked directly into my mother's cold, piercing blue eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not offer any weak apologies or long-winded explanations. I simply opened my mouth and let the single most terrifying word I had ever spoken fall from my lips. No. Brenda blinked. She stared at me as if the word had been spoken in a foreign language she did not comprehend. She tilted her head and ordered me to repeat myself. I told her no. I told her I would not go to the bank tomorrow. I told her I would not sign those loan papers. I told her I would not take out a $30,000 personal loan. I told her I was completely and permanently done funding their spectacular lies. I braced my entire body for the inevitable explosion. I fully expected her to scream at the top of her lungs. I expected her to throw the heavy leather folder across the room, to hurl vicious insults at me, to break down into a theatrical sobbing fit of victimhood. But she did none of those things. The complete, absolute absence of her usual explosive hysteria was infinitely more terrifying. The tiny room went dead silent. The faint mechanical hum of the washing machines from the laundromat below seemed to echo loudly in the heavy stillness. Brenda slowly reached out her hand and picked up her leather folder. She smoothed the front of her expensive coat with deliberate, incredibly precise movements. Her face smoothed out into a blank mask of pure, chilling composure. She did not look angry or betrayed. She looked at me the exact way an exterminator looks at a pest that has suddenly become an unexpected inconvenience. The corners of her mouth curled upward into a very small, tight, and utterly terrifying smile. It was a smile completely devoid of any genuine human warmth. She turned and walked toward the door, her high heels clicking softly and methodically against the cheap linoleum floor. She paused with her manicured hand resting lightly on the brass doorknob. She did not even turn around to face me. She simply spoke over her shoulder, her voice dripping with an icy, venomous calm that made every single hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. You will regret forgetting who gave you life. The heavy click of this brass doorknob echoed in my cramped apartment long after my mother had gone. I stood frozen in the center of my living room, staring at the cheap linoleum floor where she had just delivered her chilling threat. You will regret forgetting who gave you life. The words hung in the stale air, heavy and suffocating. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I did not collapse. I did not chase after her down the narrow stairwell to beg for her forgiveness. For the first time in my entire 28 years of existence, I had looked the architect of my misery directly in the eye and refused to be her financial stepping stone. I took a deep, shaky breath and waited for the fallout. I did not have to wait long. The punishment began the very next morning. It did not come in the form of screaming phone calls or vicious text messages. In a family that operates on toxic manipulation, silence is the ultimate weapon. It is designed to starve you of connection until you crawl back begging to be used again. I woke up to find that I had been entirely excommunicated from the Evans family. I was removed from the shared digital wedding planner board. My mother blocked me on all social media platforms. The family group chat, which usually pinged incessantly with updates about floral arrangements and tuxedo fittings, went completely dead. Even my father, Richard, who usually sent me a passive-aggressive text every Friday morning demanding cash for his landscaping bill, suddenly stopped contacting me. It was a total and absolute blackout. They were erasing me from my brother's wedding simply because I refused to bankrupt myself to fund it. For the first 3 days, the isolation felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I kept checking my phone, expecting the silence to break. I still harbored this tiny, pathetic shred of hope that my brother Lucas would intervene. Lucas was the golden child, the handsome, oblivious center of our family universe. I desperately wanted to believe that he would recognize the sheer insanity of our mother demanding I take out a $30,000 loan for his rehearsal dinner. I wanted him to protect me just this once. My phone finally rang on a Thursday evening. The caller ID flashed my brother's name. I answered immediately, feeling a sudden rush of relief. But the voice on the other end of the line was not calling to offer comfort or support. Lucas sounded agitated and profoundly annoyed. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask how I was managing my 60-hour work weeks at the medical billing office. He just sighed heavily into the receiver. "Maya, you need to fix this," he said, his voice dripping with exhausted entitlement. "Mom has been having near constant panic attacks for 3 days. Jasmine's parents just finalized the contract for a live string quartet during the cocktail hour, and Mom is absolutely spiraling. She says we are going to look like trash next to them." I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter, my knuckles turning white. "Lucas," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "She wants me to take out a $30,000 personal loan. I barely make rent. I am eating instant noodles for dinner. I cannot fund your rehearsal dinner. It will ruin my life." Lucas let out a loud, exasperated groan. "You are being completely dramatic, Maya. It is just money. You can pay it off over time. Jasmine's family is old money real estate. They expect a certain standard. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? My own sister is refusing to pitch in for the most important day of my life. Just apologize to Mom. Sign the papers and make this tension go away. You are ruining my wedding over your foolish pride." I closed my eyes as hot tears of pure betrayal spilled down my cheeks. He did not care about my financial survival. He only cared about his aesthetic. He wanted me to set myself on fire so he could bask in the warm glow of the flames. He was so completely shielded by my parents' lies that he truly believed a $30,000 debt was just a minor inconvenience. I took a slow, deep breath, swallowing the sob rising in my throat. "No, Lucas," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "I am not your bank. I am not Mom's bank. I will not sign those papers." There was a beat of stunned silence on the line. Then Lucas scoffed. "You are unbelievable," he muttered, and he hung up on me. The line went dead, and with it went the very last tether I had to my biological family. The excommunication was now absolute. But as the days slowly turned into weeks, something highly unexpected began to happen. The crushing anxiety that had lived in my chest for a decade began to loosen. The constant, terrified anticipation of my mother's next financial demand started to fade. For a solid month, things went completely quiet. The calendar flipped from one month to the next, and the wedding date drew closer. I threw myself into my work at the medical billing firm, picking up extra shifts not to pay my parents' property taxes, but to finally start building my own pathetic savings account. I went to the grocery store and bought fresh vegetables instead of ramen. I bought a new book and read it in the quiet of my apartment without a single harassing phone call interrupting my peace. I began to experience the illusion of peace. I sat in my tiny living room listening to the hum of the laundromat below, and I smiled to myself. I actually believed I had won. I thought that by standing my ground and enduring their cruel, silent treatment, I had successfully set a permanent boundary. I convinced myself that because I had physically removed myself from their grasp, they had no choice but to accept my refusal. I imagined them downsizing the rehearsal dinner or finding a cheaper venue. I foolishly believed that taking away my checkbook meant I had completely severed their access to my future. I was so incredibly naive. I thought the silence meant they had surrendered. I had absolutely no idea that in a family built on deception and greed, silence does not mean defeat. Silence means they are working in the dark. I thought my firm refusal had stopped them from taking my money. I was completely unaware that saying no did not stop Brenda and Richard Evans. It merely forced them to get creative. They had stopped asking me for permission, and they had started plotting a crime so devastating it would soon threaten to obliterate my entire existence. The illusion of peace lasted exactly 32 days. For a month, I sat at my dual monitors in the windowless medical billing office processing claims and convincing myself the worst was finally over. I had said no to my mother. I survived the silent treatment. I genuinely believed I had successfully defended my meager territory. I spent those weeks working overtime, saving every spare dollar I could scrape together. My ultimate goal was to save enough to move out of the noisy apartment above the laundromat. I checked my bank accounts daily, watching the numbers slowly climb. I felt a fragile sense of pride building a life independent of the Evans family financial sinkhole. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkably dull and gray. I was fighting with a hostile insurance adjuster over a denied pediatric claim. My headset was pressed tightly against my ear, my fingers flying across the keyboard to document the call. I was so completely focused on navigating the intricate rules of deductibles that I almost ignored the sudden vibration of my cell phone resting on the edge of my desk. It buzzed once, then twice in rapid succession. I glanced over casually, expecting an automated reminder about a dental appointment. Instead, the bright screen illuminated a push notification from my credit monitoring application. It was an urgent alert regarding a hard credit inquiry. I frowned, losing my train of thought mid-sentence with the insurance adjuster. I placed the call on hold and picked up my phone. A hard inquiry meant someone had applied for new credit. I had not applied for a loan, a credit card, or even an apartment lease in over 3 years. I tapped the notification, my heart rate accelerating with mild confusion. The application required facial recognition to open, and the 2 seconds it took to scan my face felt strangely long. I told myself it was probably a bank error. Working in billing, I knew how often numerical mistakes happened. The screen loaded, replacing the home dashboard with a massive red warning banner. The numbers materialized in bold, stark font directly beneath my name. My pristine credit score, the absolute only financial safety net I possessed in the entire world, had plummeted by over 160 points. I stopped breathing. The air in my cubicle suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. I frantically tapped on the detailed report, my hands trembling so violently I almost dropped the phone. The screen populated with the active open accounts currently tied to my Social Security number. Right at the top of the list, listed as open just 5 days ago, was a home equity line of credit. The balance was an incomprehensible $180,000. I stared at the screen, my mind failing to process the magnitude of the number. A home equity line requires a property to secure the loan. I lived in a rented shoebox above a laundromat. I did not own a home. I clicked the Details tab and a property address loaded. It was a luxury address located in an exclusive gated community across the city. It was a property I had never seen, never visited, and certainly never purchased. But the financial nightmare did not stop there. Directly beneath the massive, fraudulent mortgage loan was another newly established account. It was a premium-tier signature credit card from a major national bank. The balance on that card was completely maxed out at $40,000. $220,000 of brand new unsecured and secured debt had been chained around my neck in less than a week. The names associated with the recent massive charges on the credit card leaped off the glowing screen. Luxury catering companies, high-end bridal boutiques, exclusive event rental agencies. The pieces clicked together with the sickening precision of a loaded gun. My mother Brenda had not surrendered when I refused to take out that personal loan. She had simply realized it would be much easier to steal my identity and take everything she needed to fund my brother Lucas and his spectacular wedding charade. The physical reaction hit me like a high-speed collision. A loud, ringing sound erupted in my ears, drowning out the buzzing fluorescent lights and the chatter of my coworkers. My vision tunneled the edges of the room, going completely black, until all I could see were those horrific numbers glowing on my phone. I tried to inhale, but my chest felt like it was wrapped in tight iron bands. I was suffocating. I gripped the edge of my plastic desk so hard my fingernails dug painfully into the laminate. Bile rose hot and acidic in the back of my throat. I stood up abruptly, knocking my rolling chair backward until it slammed loudly into the filing cabinet behind me. I grabbed my purse, my keys, and my phone and practically ran down the narrow aisle toward the emergency exit. I pushed through the heavy metal stairwell doors and collapsed onto the concrete landing, gasping desperately for air. My legs gave out entirely, and I sank down onto the cold, dirty steps, clutching my phone to my chest. My perfect credit score was gone. It had been my absolute pride and joy, my singular achievement in a family that valued nothing but appearances. I had spent a decade paying my parents' late bills on time purely to protect that number because I knew it was my only ticket out. I needed that score to eventually secure a mortgage to buy a reliable car, to simply exist as an independent adult. It was the only thing I owned that my parents could not legally touch, or so I thought. I sat on the concrete stairs, trembling uncontrollably as the sheer, terrifying reality washed over me. I was 28 years old and I was financially ruined. The massive debt was perfectly structured. If the minimum payments were missed, the bank would come after me. My mother had forged my signature, bypassed my security questions, and successfully hijacked my entire identity to buy a luxury starter home for my brother. She had literally stolen my future to pay for his present. The cold concrete floor bit through my thin clearance rack dress as I rocked back and forth, trying to force oxygen into my burning lungs. I felt utterly violated, stripped of my autonomy, and cornered by the very people who were supposed to protect me. I sat on that cold concrete stairwell for exactly 14 minutes, watching the digital clock on my phone screen tick by while I struggled to push oxygen past the crushing weight in my chest. I wanted to curl into a ball and disappear into the gray cinder block walls. I wanted to scream until my vocal cords tore. But then something shifted deep inside me. The terrified 28-year-old daughter vanished, and the meticulous medical billing specialist took over. In my line of work, I dealt with ruthless insurance conglomerates every single day. I spent my life hunting down missing decimal points, fighting fraudulent claim rejections, and forcing massive corporations to hand over their internal documents. Numbers left a trail. Nobody in my entire family was better at following a paper trail than I was. I wiped my face, straightened my cheap navy blue dress, and stood up. My legs were no longer shaking. I walked back into the office, sat down at my desk, and pulled up my dual monitors. I took a sharp, deep breath and dialed the customer service number listed on the fraud alert. I did not call as a panicked, helpless victim. I called with the cold, clinical authority of an auditor preparing for war. The automated system tried to route me through endless menus, but I bypassed the queue and reached the primary fraud department. A representative named David answered, his voice bored and heavily scripted. I cut him off before he could even finish his opening greeting. I clearly stated my full legal name, my social security number, and my immediate demand. I told him a $180,000 home equity line of credit and a $40,000 signature credit card had been fraudulently opened using my stolen identity. David tried to read from his standard company script, telling me they would mail a physical dispute packet that could take up to 30 business days to fully process. I told him 30 days was completely unacceptable. I slipped effortlessly into my professional billing persona, using the exact legal terminology required to escalate a priority breach. I demanded an immediate hard freeze on all associated accounts and requested direct electronic copies of the loan origination documents to be sent to my secure email instantly. David hesitated, claiming the documents were still processing. I calmly quoted the exact federal banking regulations regarding identity theft and mandatory consumer disclosure. I did not raise my voice, but I made it absolutely clear that if those digital documents were not in my inbox within the next 10 minutes, my very next call would be to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and my retained attorney. 3 minutes later, an encrypted email appeared in my inbox. I opened the attached PDF files and my eyes instantly went into audit mode, scanning the dense legal jargon for discrepancies. The electronic signatures at the bottom of the loan agreements were flawless digital copies of my own handwriting. Whoever did this had unrestricted access to my old tax returns and my social security card. But digital signatures carry hidden, unalterable metadata. I bypassed the signature graphics and scrolled straight down to the security authentication certificate attached to the final page of the digital contract. The document contained the exact timestamp and the originating IP address where the signature was officially executed. I copied the IP address and ran a quick trace. My stomach plummeted to the floor. The location pinned perfectly to the wealthy suburban neighborhood where my parents lived. It was the exact static IP address associated with my father Richard's home office router. The very router I had personally set up and secured for him 3 years ago when he claimed he needed help organizing his business emails. He had used the very network I configured to hijack my entire financial existence. But the betrayal cut even deeper as I traced the initial flow of the stolen funds. The $40,000 credit card limit had already been completely exhausted within 72 hours. I pulled up the itemized transaction history. There were massive pending charges to high-end floral boutiques, luxury event rental agencies, and a premier downtown catering company. The exact prestigious vendors my mother Brenda had been loudly bragging about hiring for my brother Lucas and his perfect rehearsal dinner. I had refused to take out a $30,000 personal loan to fund her illusion, so she simply stole my identity to take out $40,000 instead. The maxed-out credit card, however, was only a small fraction of the total devastation. I turned my undivided attention to the home equity line of credit, $180,000. I scoured the loan disbursement details, tracking exactly where that cash had been wired. The funds did not sit in a standard holding account. They had been routed immediately upon final approval into a newly incorporated limited liability company. I ran a corporate search through the state business registry. The company was named Evans Legacy Events. It had been officially registered just 10 days prior. The listed managing partners were Richard and Brenda Evans. I felt a cold, nauseating wave of absolute clarity wash over my entire body. I clicked back to the primary loan application to carefully examine the collateral section. The massive loan was secured against a stunning modern starter home located in a highly exclusive gated community across the city. I recognized the listed property address instantly. It was the exact luxury home Lucas and his wealthy fiancée Jasmine had been touring last month. Lucas had excitedly shown me high-resolution pictures of the sprawling manicured backyard and the state-of-the-art gourmet kitchen right before I had been banished from the family circle. He had casually mentioned that Jasmine's parents were making a generous financial contribution, but my parents had proudly promised to handle the entire down payment to prove their equal standing. The final pieces of the horrifying puzzle locked into place with a devastating, sickening crunch. My parents were completely broke. They had been secretly bankrupt for a decade. They had absolutely no liquid cash to match the massive financial contributions of Jasmine's wealthy real estate family. So they created an elaborate, monstrous lie to maintain their facade. They formed a fake event company to silently launder the stolen money. They used my immaculate credit history, the same credit history I had bled for 10 years to fiercely protect, to secure a massive fraudulent loan. They took those stolen funds and quietly deposited them as a massive down payment on a luxury mansion for their golden child. They were buying my brother a wealthy lifestyle using my hijacked identity. My mother had looked me dead in the eye in my cramped, depressing apartment and told me I would regret forgetting who gave me life. She was not just issuing a petty warning. She was giving me a terrifying promise. She had decided that because I lived a modest, practical life, I did not need my own credit. She decided my entire future was completely expendable if it meant elevating Lucas into high society. I sat alone in my cubicle holding irrefutable proof of a federal crime committed by the very people who raised me. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was almost too massive to fully comprehend. They had intentionally left me with $250,000 in fraudulent high-interest debt. When the minimum payments inevitably came due and they lacked the funds to cover them, the bank would come directly after me. My hard-earned wages would be immediately garnished. I would be dragged into endless civil litigation. I would never be able to rent a decent apartment, buy a reliable vehicle, or build any kind of secure, independent life. I would be trapped in complete financial ruin for the rest of my natural life. While my brother hosted lavish dinner parties in his beautiful stolen mansion, they had systematically dismantled my entire existence to build a glittering pedestal for their golden child. I stared at the glowing monitor, my eyes burning with sudden, terrifying intensity. The profound sadness was completely gone. The lingering childhood desire for their approval evaporated like water on a hot skillet. In its place, a cold, brilliant fury took root deep inside my chest. They assumed I was just a quiet, obedient medical biller who would simply absorb the catastrophic hit out of pure family obligation. They thought I would be too scared of the public scandal to ever fight back. They were absolutely, unequivocally wrong. I printed every page of the loan origination documents, the wire transfer logs, and the IP address tracing data. I stacked the warm printed papers neatly into a crisp manila folder. I placed the folder securely into my leather work bag, making sure not a single page was bent or out of place. I gathered my car keys and my jacket from the back of my rolling chair. I was no longer the helpless, terrified daughter hiding on the cold concrete stairs. I was an auditor, and I had just found the ultimate unpardonable discrepancy. I walked out of the office knowing exactly where I had to go next. The drive from my office to the sprawling suburban neighborhood where my parents lived felt like a blur of sheer adrenaline. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my rattling 10-year-old sedan so tightly that my knuckles ached. Every red light I hit felt like a taunt, but it only gave me more time to let the cold, clinical fury harden inside my chest. I pulled into their wide, perfectly paved driveway, parking directly behind my father's expensive leased SUV. The contrast between my battered car and their pristine property was a glaring physical representation of my entire life. I grabbed the thick manila folder from the passenger seat. It contained every single page of the forged loan documents, the tracing data, and the unassailable proof of their federal crimes. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I used the tarnished brass key I still kept on my keyring and pushed open the heavy mahogany front door. The air inside the house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and fresh roasted coffee. It was the scent of a peaceful, wealthy Sunday morning, completely detached from the absolute devastation they had just unleashed upon my life. I marched down the wide hallway, my cheap, sensible work shoes clicking sharply against the imported hardwood floors. I found them in the massive, open-concept kitchen. The kitchen they had remodeled 3 years ago, using money they absolutely did not have. My father, Richard, was sitting on a plush leather bar stool, casually reading an article on his tablet. My mother, Brenda, was standing by the espresso machine wearing a pristine white silk robe. They looked up as I entered, completely unbothered by my sudden intrusion. I did not offer a greeting. I did not ask how their day was going. I walked directly up to the massive white marble kitchen island and slammed the thick manila folder down with a violent crack. The force of the impact caused the neatly stacked papers to slide out and fan across the polished stone surface. Right on top was the final signature page of the home equity line of credit bearing the flawless digital forgery of my own name. I waited for the panic. I waited for the blood to drain from their faces as they realized they had been caught red-handed committing a $250,000 fraud. But the panic never came. My father calmly looked down at the scattered documents. He did not flinch. He did not widen his eyes. He simply reached out, picked up his porcelain mug, and took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. My mother leaned over the marble island, her eyes scanning the bold red bank logos and the highlighted IP address logs I had meticulously prepared. She recognized exactly what the papers were. And then she did something that will haunt me for the rest of my natural life. Brenda threw her head back and actually laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a hysterical laugh. It was a light, dismissive, genuinely amused sound. It was the exact same laugh she used when a waitress brought her the wrong vintage of wine at a restaurant. I stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer sociopathic audacity of her reaction. "You stole my identity," I said, my voice trembling with a rage so profound it physically hurt my throat. "You forged my signature to take out $180,000 against a house to buy a mansion for Lucas. You maxed out a $40,000 credit card in my name." Brenda waved her manicured hand, brushing away my accusations as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and freely admitted to the entire scheme without a single ounce of remorse. "You refused to give us the money voluntarily, Maya," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You were being incredibly selfish about that tiny personal loan I asked you to take out. We did what we had to do for your brother's future. Jasmine's family expects a certain standard, and we refused to look like peasants in front of them. We simply leveraged your excellent credit history because you certainly are not using it for anything important. We will pay the monthly minimums on the accounts. Stop being so incredibly dramatic." I felt the floor drop out from underneath me. The absolute lack of empathy, the staggering entitlement was beyond anything I had ever witnessed. She truly believed my entire existence, my financial security, my legal identity was just an asset for her to harvest and deploy whenever she saw fit. She viewed my pristine credit score as community property. "I am not being dramatic," I said, stepping closer to the island, my chest heaving. "You committed felony wire fraud and grand larceny. You have completely destroyed my financial future. If you miss a single payment, the bank will come after me. They will garnish my wages. They will ruin my life." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I held it up so they could both clearly see the screen. "I am leaving this house right now," I told them, my voice hardening into a sharp, steady blade. "I am driving directly to the police precinct and I am filing a full report for identity theft. I have the IP address logs proving the digital signatures originated from this exact house. You are going to cancel that loan or you are going to federal prison." For a fraction of a second, Brenda's smug smile finally faltered. She looked at my father, panic suddenly flashing in her eyes. But Richard did not look panicked. He slowly set his coffee mug down on the marble counter. The soft clink of the porcelain sounded like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. He stood up from his bar stool, towering over me. The mask of the quiet, passive husband evaporated completely, revealing the ruthless, calculating predator hiding underneath. "You are not going to call the police, Maya," he said, his voice dangerously low and smooth. "You are going to leave those documents on this island, you are going to walk out that front door, and you are going to keep your mouth completely shut." I gripped my phone tighter, my thumb hovering over the keypad. "Watch me," I challenged. Richard let out a dark, humorless chuckle. He leaned across the marble island, planting his heavy hands on the scattered loan documents. He looked directly into my eyes and played his ultimate trump card. "Do you remember that joint checking account we opened at the local credit union when you were 16, he asked. "The one you used for your little after-school tutoring job." I frowned, completely thrown off balance by the sudden shift in conversation. I remembered the account. It was a basic student checking account. I had not used it or even thought about it in over a decade. I remained listed as the custodial parent on that account. Richard continued, his lips twisting into a sinister grin. "When my supply business started failing 10 years ago, I needed a place to hide liquid cash from the bankruptcy courts and the aggressive creditors. So I routed thousands of dollars of unreported under-the-table income directly through your little student checking account. It was the perfect hiding spot because nobody audits a teenager." The air vanished from my lungs. The horrific implications of his words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. "Because your name is the primary name on that account," Richard explained, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. "The Internal Revenue Service will view every single dollar of that unreported income as yours. You are a professional medical billing specialist, Maya. You work in finance. You know exactly what happens to professionals who are caught hiding assets and committing tax evasion." I stared at him, my entire body shaking with pure, unadulterated terror. He had weaponized my own childhood against my adulthood. He had built a fail-safe trap years before I even knew I was in danger. "If you walk into a police station and report this loan fraud," he threatened, taking a step closer until he was mere inches from my face, "I will simultaneously submit anonymous tips and completely fabricated ledgers directly to the Internal Revenue Service. I will provide them with the account numbers. I will show them the deposit history. It will look exactly like you were the one laundering money. You will lose your medical billing certification immediately. You will face massive federal tax penalties that will absolutely bankrupt you. And you will be the one facing prison time." The trap sprang shut with a deafening finality. The invisible steel jaws clamped down on my throat. They had perfectly engineered a situation where my own destruction was guaranteed no matter what path I chose. If I stayed silent, I was chained to $250,000 of fraudulent debt that would inevitably ruin me when they stopped paying the minimums. If I fought back and exposed their theft, my own father would frame me for federal tax evasion and obliterate my career and my freedom. They had thought of absolutely everything. My mother stepped up beside him, her confidence completely restored. She crossed her arms over her silk robe and smiled that same chilling victory smile. "Like I said, Maya," she purred, her voice laced with venomous satisfaction, "you will regret forgetting who gave you life. Now leave the papers on the counter and go back to your apartment. We have a wedding to finish planning." I could not breathe. I could not speak. The sheer magnitude of their evil was so overwhelming it paralyzed my vocal cords. I looked at the scattered documents on the marble island, the physical proof of my stolen identity, and realized they were completely useless to me now. I slowly lowered my phone, my hand trembling so badly I almost dropped the device onto the floor. I took a step backward, away from the island, away from the two monsters wearing my parents' faces. I turned around and stumbled blindly down the wide, imported hardwood hallway. I pushed through the heavy mahogany front door and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. The bright suburban sunlight felt harsh and mocking. I practically fell into the driver's seat of my rattling sedan, pulling the door shut and locking it. I gripped the steering wheel and finally let the tears fall. I sobbed until my ribs ached and my throat burned. I was entirely trapped in a flawless criminal web spun by the people who were supposed to protect me. I felt utterly broken, terrified, and completely defeated as I started the engine and drove away from the glass house, leaving my stolen future behind. I sat on the faded carpet of my living room, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my laptop. The cursor blinked rhythmically against a pristine white document, mocking my complete paralysis. My fingers hovered over the plastic keyboard, cold and trembling. I was trying desperately to draft my formal resignation letter. Giving up my position as a senior medical billing specialist felt exactly like voluntarily cutting off my own oxygen supply. I spent countless exhausting nights deciphering complex insurance codes and building a flawless reputation as the most reliable employee in my corporate department. It was the only thing in my existence that I had built completely for myself. But my father, Richard, had made his threat perfectly clear. If I dared to report the $250,000 of fraudulent debt my parents had maliciously taken out in my stolen name, he would gladly hand over doctored financial ledgers to the Internal Revenue Service. He would brutally frame me for the money laundering he committed through my teenage checking account 10 years ago. I knew exactly how ruthless federal tax audits could be. I knew a medical billing professional accused of severe financial crimes would never work in the healthcare industry again. I would inevitably face federal prison time. My parents had engineered an inescapable psychological prison, and the only way to survive was to surrender my career, my credit, and my future. I slowly typed the words "to whom it may concern." A single hot tear dropped onto my wrist. I was 28 years old and my life was effectively over. I was going to work minimum wage cash jobs for the rest of my life just to pay off a luxury starter house my golden child brother Lucas was about to move into. I typed my deep regret and my intent to resign effective immediately. My chest ached with a hollow, suffocating grief. The sheer catastrophic injustice of it all pressed down on my shoulders until I could barely keep my head lifted. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing ring of my cell phone shattered the dead silence of my apartment. I flinched violently, knocking my knee painfully against the cheap wooden coffee table. I stared at the phone sitting on the linoleum floor. My immediate terrifying thought was that it was my mother Brenda calling to gloat over her flawless victory. I imagined her calling to ensure I had actually surrendered to her malicious demands and to remind me of my worthless place in the family hierarchy. I seriously considered letting the phone ring through to voicemail. I did not have a single ounce of strength left in my exhausted body to listen to her toxic, triumphant speech. But the phone kept ringing, vibrating insistently against the floorboards, demanding my attention. I slowly crawled over and picked the device up, bracing my entire nervous system for my mother's familiar venom. I looked down at the bright caller identification screen and my breath completely caught in my tightening throat. The name flashing brightly on the digital display was Jasmine. Jasmine was my brother Lucas's beautiful fiancée. We had barely spoken more than a handful of times over the past year. Our brief interactions were entirely limited to highly polite, superficial pleasantries at incredibly tense, awkward family dinners. I knew she was a brilliant, highly successful African-American corporate auditor whose family possessed immense generational real estate wealth. I knew my mother was absolutely terrified of her family's vast financial status. But Jasmine and I had absolutely no personal relationship. She had always been perfectly kind to me, but my mother had deliberately kept us separated, ensuring I was always busy serving appetizers or scrubbing dishes in the kitchen whenever Jasmine visited our family home. Why would the wealthy bride be calling the disgraced sister on a personal cell phone in the middle of a random Thursday afternoon? A massive jolt of fresh panic hit my chest. What if Brenda had spun a brand new lie? What if my mother had preemptively told Jasmine some horrific, fabricated story about me to explain my upcoming forced absence from the wedding? I wiped my wet face fiercely with the back of my hand, clearing my dry throat and trying desperately to push down the raw, broken emotion in my voice. I took a deep, shaky breath and tapped the green button to accept the incoming call. I brought the phone into my ear and managed to say a cautious hello. I fully expected to hear a confused or perhaps deeply pitying voice on the other end. Instead, Jasmine's voice came through the small speaker, incredibly crisp, commanding, and completely devoid of any casual small talk. There was no polite, customary greeting. She sounded exactly like a seasoned senior executive who had just uncovered a catastrophic discrepancy in a highly sensitive quarterly financial report. "Maya," she said, her tone sharp and intensely focused. "I need you to listen to me very carefully right now, and I need you to answer me with absolute honesty. Are you in a safe private place where you can talk freely?" I blinked rapidly, completely thrown off balance by her intense directness. "Yes," I stammered, gripping the phone much tighter. "I am completely alone in my apartment. Jasmine, what is going on?" Jasmine gets straight to the point. "Lucas asked me to review the final vendor contracts for the wedding reception to make sure everything was fully squared away with the luxury caterers. He handed over the payment confirmations your mother proudly provided to him." My stomach instantly dropped to the floor. I knew exactly what those payment confirmations represented. They represented the stolen, fraudulent funds from the massive credit card my mother had illegally opened using my hijacked identity. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, terrified of what Jasmine was about to say next. I genuinely thought she was calling to angrily accuse me of ruining her perfect wedding. "I was looking over the wire transfer receipts your mother submitted," Jasmine continued. "She heavily redacted the personal account details, but she made a very careless, arrogant mistake. She left the routing numbers and the last 4 digits of the originating accounts visible on the main catering deposit receipt. I ran a standard verification check on those routing numbers to confirm the massive funds cleared properly. Maya, I review corporate ledgers for a living. I noticed the routing numbers your mother used to pay the caterers. Why are they drawing from a high-interest credit account in your name?" I suggested we meet at a small independent coffee shop tucked away in the downtown financial district. It was miles away from the sprawling suburban neighborhoods where my parents paraded their fake wealth. I arrived 20 minutes early, my stomach twisting into painful knots. I sat in a booth in the far back corner facing the door. My hands were clammy, clutching the thick manila folder against my chest like a physical shield. The rain was drumming relentlessly against the large glass windows, blurring the city street outside. Every time the bell above the cafe door chimed, my heart hammered against my ribs. I was utterly terrified. I still had no idea if Jasmine was calling me as an ally or an adversary. She was marrying my brother. She was supposed to be joining their side. Jasmine walked through the door exactly at noon. She did not look like a woman caught in the middle of a wedding planning crisis. She wore a sharp-tailored camel trench coat over a sleek charcoal pantsuit. Her natural hair was styled perfectly, and her dark eyes swept the room with the intense, calculating precision of a seasoned corporate auditor. She spotted me in this back booth and walked over her heels, clicking with absolute authority. She slid into the seat across from me. She did not offer a polite hug or a casual greeting. She took one look at my pale, exhausted face and the death grip I had on the manila folder. She ordered a black coffee from the passing waitress, and then she folded her hands on the table. She told me to show her exactly what I was hiding. My throat felt incredibly dry. I tried to speak, but the words stacked up in my mouth, suffocating me. For 10 long years, I had carried the massive, crushing weight of my parents' financial terror entirely alone. I had hidden their secrets, paid their bills, and endured their vicious emotional abuse without ever telling a single living soul. Handing over this folder meant exposing the grotesque reality of my family to an outsider. It meant admitting how completely I had been used. My hands shook violently as I unclasped the folder and pushed it across the wooden table. I watched her face closely as she opened it. I showed her everything. I showed her the finalized home equity line of credit for $180,000. I showed her the completely maxed out $40,000 signature credit card. I showed her the traced IP address logs proving the digital signatures had originated from my father's home office router. And finally, I showed her the corporate registry documents for Evans Legacy Events, the fake limited liability company my parents created to quickly launder the stolen money. As Jasmine methodically flipped through the pages, I felt the massive dam inside my chest finally shatter. The tears I had been desperately holding back for days suddenly spilled over my eyelashes. I buried my face in my hands and wept. I sobbed right there in the middle of the crowded coffee shop, completely unable to hold the facade together anymore. I whispered through my tears that my mother had forged my signature. I told her that if I went to the police, my father was going to submit doctored financial ledgers to the Internal Revenue Service and frame me for federal tax evasion. I told her I was completely trapped. Jasmine did not interrupt me. She did not offer hollow platitudes or tell me that everything was going to be fine. She simply sat there reading every single line of the forged documents with chilling, focused intensity. She analyzed the wire transfer dates, comparing them against the vendor receipts she had brought with her in her own leather portfolio. When she finally reached the final page, she slowly closed the folder. She took a slow, deep breath and looked across the table at me. Her dark eyes were blazing with a cold, terrifying fury. It was not the explosive, hysterical anger my mother used to control people. It was the quiet, dangerous anger of a brilliant woman who absolutely despised liars. "Maya," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "this is not just a family dispute. This is felony identity theft. This is grand larceny. This is wire fraud." My mother was a corporate defense attorney, and my father built a commercial real estate empire from nothing. They taught me to spot a con artist from a mile away. I look at corporate ledgers every single day, and I have sent executives to federal prison for hiding a fraction of what your parents have stolen here. She reached across the table and placed her warm, steady hand over my trembling fingers. I felt a sudden, powerful surge of unexpected safety. She told me I was not trapped. She said my father was bluffing. She explained that any competent forensic accountant could trace those old bank deposits directly back to his failing supply business. She said they were relying entirely on my fear. They were using my love and my sense of duty to keep me paralyzed. But they made a massive, catastrophic mistake. They assumed Jasmine was just a pretty bride who would blindly sign checks. They assumed she would not audit the event ledger. Jasmine leaned closer, her voice tightening with an even deeper layer of anger. "But that is not even the worst part," she said. She opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the table toward me. It was a glossy, professionally printed investment brochure featuring my father's name. I stared at it completely bewildered. "Your parents did not just steal your identity to fund my wedding reception." Jasmine continued, her tone turning completely venomous. "They are actively trying to con my family." I felt all the blood drain completely out of my face. I asked her what she meant. "3 days ago, your father and your mother invited my dad to a private lunch at the country club," Jasmine explained. They put on their absolute best performance. They bought expensive scotch and talked endlessly about their deep family legacy and their vast suburban estate. Then your father pulled out this exact brochure. He told my dad he had exclusive access to a highly lucrative commercial real estate flip downtown. He claimed he was offering my dad a ground floor opportunity to partner with the Evans family on a multi-million-dollar development. He asked my dad to wire a $100,000 good faith investment directly into a holding account. I covered my mouth with both hands, gasping in absolute horror. I asked her if the holding account was Evans' legacy events. Jasmine nodded slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. She confirmed it. They created that fake company using my stolen credit to fund the wedding. But their ultimate goal was to use the wedding to extract $100,000 in clean cash from her father. They were going to take his money, pay off the minimums on my fraudulent loans to keep the bank quiet, and pocket the rest. They saw Jasmine's family as a massive cash machine, and they saw me as the sacrificial lamb required to access it. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their plan washed over me in a suffocating wave. They were not just desperate parents trying to save face. They were calculated, ruthless predators. They were perfectly willing to destroy my entire financial future and actively defraud their future daughter-in-law's family just to maintain their pathetic suburban illusion. They were going to let Lucas marry into a family they were actively robbing. They were going to ruin his life too. My dad is no fool, Jasmine said, her voice snapping my attention back to the present. He immediately flagged the investment pitch as highly suspicious. He told your father he needed his legal team to review the holding account before transferring any funds. When he asked me to look into the Evans family financials, I noticed the catering routing numbers did not match any standard checking accounts. That is when I found your name tied to the high-interest credit line. I knew something was horribly wrong, but I had no idea they had literally stolen your identity. I looked at the forged loan documents sitting between us. I looked at the fake investment brochure my father had handed to her dad. The monumental weight of my parents' deception was staggering. I had spent 10 years working 60-hour weeks at the medical billing office, giving them every spare dollar I had just to keep them afloat. And their gratitude was a concerted effort to obliterate my existence and rob the very people my brother loved. "We have to call the police," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. "We have to take these documents to the authorities right now." I told her I would take the risk with the tax evasion threat. I did not care anymore. They had to be stopped. Jasmine did not move. She sat back in her booth and looked at me with a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. The string quartet music I had been listening to in my car hours earlier suddenly echoed in my memory. Jasmine was not just a corporate auditor. She was a woman whose family fiercely protected their own. And by exposing this truth, I had just become part of the people she protected. "No, Maya," she said, her voice incredibly calm and chillingly precise. "If we just call the police right now, they will lawyer up immediately. They will spin a story about a misunderstanding. Your mother will cry. Your father will lie. They will find a way to minimize the damage and drag you through years of agonizing legal battles behind closed doors. They thrive in the shadows. They survive by manipulating the narrative in private." She reached out and tapped the top of the manila folder. "They care about their image more than anything else in this world," Jasmine continued. "They care about the country club. They care about looking like old money. They were perfectly willing to destroy you in the dark to protect their glittering facade in the light. So we are not going to fight them in the dark." I stared at her, my heart pounding with a mixture of raw fear and sudden thrilling anticipation. I asked her what she was suggesting. Jasmine leaned across the small wooden table, the chaotic noise of the coffee shop fading away completely. She looked at me with absolute, unwavering certainty. She told me we do not just call the cops. We wait. We let them put on their expensive clothes. We let them walk into that magnificent ballroom. We let them stand in front of every single wealthy friend and family member they are so desperately trying to impress. And then we tear their fake kingdom down brick by brick in front of a live audience. She said we do not just call the cops, we make an example out of them. The absolute brilliance of her proposition settled over me like a heavy protective blanket. For the first time in my entire life, I was not facing my abusers alone. I had an ally who possessed the resources, the intelligence, and the ruthless determination to match their cruelty. I looked at the forged signature on the bank loan, and then I looked back at Jasmine. I did not shed another tear. The frightened daughter was gone forever. I gave a single slow nod, and we immediately began to build the perfect trap. Jasmine moved with the terrifying efficiency of a woman who destroyed corporate criminals before her morning coffee. Within 48 hours of our meeting at that rainy downtown cafe, she had arranged a sit-down with a man named Marcus Vance. Marcus was not a small-town family lawyer or a strip mall attorney. He was a ruthless, high-powered federal fraud litigator who operated out of a massive glass corner office on the 42nd floor of a downtown skyscraper. When Jasmine and I walked into his immaculate suite, my cheap clearance rack shoes sank silently into the plush carpet. I felt incredibly out of place, but Jasmine walked with her head held high, treating the multi-million-dollar law firm like her own personal playground. Marcus was a shark in a tailored Italian suit. He did not offer warm smiles or sympathetic platitudes. He simply poured us 2 glasses of sparkling water, sat behind his massive mahogany desk, and asked to see the manila folder. I handed it over, my hands still shaking slightly. For 30 agonizing minutes, the only sound in that massive office was the soft turning of paper and the distant hum of the city traffic far below. Marcus meticulously examined the forged home equity line of credit, the maxed-out signature credit card statements, the IP address logs, and the corporate registry for Evan's legacy events. When he finally looked up, his eyes were completely devoid of any warmth. He looked at Jasmine, and then he looked directly at me. He told me that my parents had not just committed a simple family financial indiscretion. They had committed grand larceny, wire fraud, identity theft, and federal bank fraud. He explained that by routing the stolen funds through a fake limited liability company to purchase a luxury home, they had officially crossed the line into money laundering. My father, Richard, threatening to frame me for tax evasion was simply the icing on their criminal cake. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He told me we had enough paper evidence to trigger a massive federal investigation, but paper trails can sometimes be explained away by expensive defense attorneys claiming clerical errors or verbal consent. He needed something completely bulletproof. He needed a direct, uncoerced confession. Because we lived in a single-party consent state, I had the legal right to record any conversation I was actively participating in without notifying the other parties. Marcus looked me dead in the eye and asked if I had the stomach to walk back into the lion's den and bait my mother into admitting her crimes on tape. I thought about the crushing $250,000 debt chained around my neck. I thought about the luxury mansion my golden child brother was about to casually move into. I swallowed the lump of terror in my throat and told Marcus I would do exactly what needed to be done. 2 days later, I drove my rattling 10-year-old sedan back to my parents' sprawling suburban estate. My heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. Taped securely beneath my plain white blouse was a state-of-the-art digital recording wire provided directly by Marcus Vance. The tiny microphone rested flat against my sternum, capturing every single ragged breath I took. I walked up the perfectly manicured walkway and used my key to open the heavy mahogany front door. The house smelled of expensive catering and fresh lilies. My parents were hosting a small casual dinner to finalize the floral arrangements for the upcoming wedding. Lucas was not there. It was just Richard and Brenda sitting at the massive marble kitchen island drinking imported wine. When I walked into the kitchen, the room went completely dead silent. My mother set her crystal wine glass down, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She demanded to know why I was there after she had explicitly ordered me to go back to my miserable apartment and stay quiet. I forced my hands to stop shaking. I channeled every ounce of professional composure I had ever used dealing with hostile insurance adjusters. I looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, deliberately playing the role of the broken, defeated daughter she so desperately wanted me to be. I told her I was terrified. I said I had received another aggressive alert from the Credit Monitoring Bureau and that the bank was demanding verification for the home equity line of credit. I let my voice crack intentionally. I begged her to explain how she had managed to open a $180,000 loan in my name when my credit file had strict security blocks in place. I pleaded with her to tell me how she bypassed my security questions because the bank was threatening to investigate. Brenda let out that same chilling, dismissive laugh. She took the bait with the arrogant, greedy enthusiasm of a predator who truly believes she is invincible. She picked up her wine glass and looked at me with absolute contempt. She told me I was completely pathetic. She explicitly stated right into the hidden microphone that she had simply dug out my old Social Security card from her filing cabinet and used her maternal knowledge of my security questions to bypass the credit bureaus. She laughed as she bragged about tracing my digital signature from an old tax return and perfectly replicating it on the loan documents. Richard chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension, adding that they had to route the money through Evan's legacy events to make the massive down payment look perfectly legitimate to Jasmine's family. Brenda took a sip of her wine and smiled that venomous, victorious smile. She literally said the words, "You refused to give us the money voluntarily. So I took exactly what we needed to secure your brother's future. And if you ever breathe a word of this to anyone, your father will mail those doctored ledgers to the IRS, and you will rot in federal prison." She told me to stop being a dramatic nuisance and go home. I stood there feeling the cold metallic wire pressing against my chest, absorbing every single damning syllable. I lowered my head, apologized weakly for interrupting their evening, and walked out the front door. The moment I climbed into my car and locked the doors, I let out a massive, trembling breath. I had them. I had the absolute, undisputed proof that would destroy their entire fake empire. I drove straight to Jasmine's luxury downtown apartment. Marcus Vance was waiting for us in her living room. I handed him the recording device. He plugged it into his encrypted laptop and hit play. We sat in absolute silence as my mother's cruel, arrogant voice filled the room, confessing to every single federal crime with terrifying clarity. When the recording finished, Marcus simply closed his laptop and gave a sharp, satisfied nod. He told us this was the exact silver bullet we needed. The very next morning, Marcus arranged a highly confidential meeting with a senior detective at the Financial Crimes Division. We sat in a sterile gray interrogation room laying out the forged loan documents, the fake LLC registry, the wire transfer logs, and finally playing the crystal-clear audio recording. The detective, a hardened veteran who had spent decades unraveling complex corporate frauds, sat completely motionless as he listened to Brenda boast about ruining my life. When the tape ended, the detective looked at me with an expression of profound disgust aimed entirely at my parents. He immediately began drafting the comprehensive affidavits required for the arrest warrants. The sheer mountain of evidence was so overwhelming it left absolutely no room for doubt. But Jasmine and I had spent hours discussing the execution of this justice. We did not just want them quietly arrested on a random Tuesday morning. We wanted them to face the absolute maximum social and financial destruction they had so viciously tried to inflict upon us. Jasmine looked at the detective and made a highly strategic, deeply personal request. She explained that her own father was currently being targeted by Richard for a $100,000 fraudulent investment scam under the guise of this wedding. She told the detective that my parents valued their fake country club status more than they valued oxygen. She explicitly asked the detective to process the warrants, but to temporarily hold the actual physical arrests until the day of the wedding reception. She wanted them completely surrounded by the wealthy elite they had desperately conned. She wanted every single lie exposed in the bright, blinding light of day. The detective looked at Marcus, then looked back at Jasmine. He understood exactly what she was asking for. He agreed to coordinate the execution of the warrants with the local precinct for the evening of the reception. With the legal trap perfectly set and the arrest warrants quietly waiting in the dark, Jasmine turned her absolute focus to the logistical execution of our revenge. She was the bride, which meant she held unquestioned ultimate authority over the wedding venue. My parents were so incredibly blinded by their own successful fraud that they completely ignored the operational details, assuming Jasmine was simply handling the aesthetics. They had absolutely no idea that Jasmine was meticulously weaponizing the entire event space. The reception was scheduled to be held at the most exclusive historic ballroom in the downtown district, a venue famous for its massive digital projection screens used for displaying elegant photo montages of the happy couple. Jasmine contacted the venue management team and used her corporate authority to quietly dismiss their standard audiovisual coordinator. She seamlessly replaced him with a highly trusted colleague from her own auditing firm, a brilliant tech specialist who completely understood the sensitive nature of our mission. For the next 2 weeks, Jasmine and I spent every single evening locked inside her apartment, operating like a covert military unit. We ordered takeout and sat on her living room floor, surrounded by highlighters, legal pads, and secure laptops. We mapped out the entire timeline of the reception down to the absolute minute. We identified the exact moment my father was scheduled to stand on the massive stage and deliver his proud, patriarchal toast to the newlyweds. We carefully extracted the most damning, horrific audio clips from my hidden wire recording. We paired those audio clips with high-resolution scans of the forged loan documents, the maxed-out credit card statements, and the fake limited liability registry. Jasmine's tech specialist perfectly synchronized the evidence files to the venue's massive projection system. We were designing a presentation that would absolutely obliterate their suburban illusion in front of 200 of the most powerful, wealthy people in the city. The feeling of taking back control was incredibly intoxicating. The crushing, suffocating anxiety that had lived in my chest my entire adult life was completely replaced by a cold, calculated determination. I was no longer the tragic victim of the Evans family. I was the architect of their total destruction. But amidst the chaotic, brilliant planning of our revenge, there was one massive, glaring complication sitting right in the center of the room. Lucas, my golden child brother. The handsome, oblivious groom who was entirely, completely ignorant of the fact that his beautiful luxury starter home was purchased with my stolen identity. Jasmine paced the hardwood floors of her apartment late one night, holding a glass of wine, her face etched with profound internal conflict. We had spent hours reviewing every single page of the financial evidence tracing every single fraudulent dollar. There was absolutely no paper trail tying Lucas to Evan's legacy events. His signature was nowhere on the loan documents. He had never been present during any of the investment pitches to Jasmine's father. From a strictly legal standpoint, Lucas was completely clean. He was just the spoiled, clueless beneficiary of our parents' monstrous crimes. The question hung heavily in the air between us. Do we tell him? Do we sit him down and expose his parents before the wedding day? It was a terrifying, agonizing dilemma. Jasmine loved him, but she absolutely despised deception. She told me she could not marry a man who was capable of participating in this kind of destruction. If we told Lucas the truth ahead of time, we risked completely blowing the operation. He had spent his entire life being fiercely protected and pampered by Brenda and Richard. He was completely conditioned to view them as flawless providers. If we showed him the evidence, there was a massive, terrifying chance he would immediately panic and warn them. He might tip them off, giving them the opportunity to flee the state or destroy further evidence or immediately execute my father's threat to frame me for tax evasion. We could not risk the integrity of the federal case. But there was an even deeper, darker fear hiding beneath the logistics. What if he already knew? What if beneath his oblivious golden child exterior, he had always known exactly how my parents funded his perfect life? What if he knew they were destroying me and he simply did not care as long as he got his luxury mansion? Jasmine sat down on the floor across from me, her dark eyes heavy with a profound, terrifying sadness. She looked at me and delivered the final absolute ruling. We agreed to a strict, unwavering vow of secrecy. We keep Lucas entirely in the dark. We do not show him the documents. We do not play him the recordings. We proceed with the wedding exactly as planned. If he is completely ignorant, she explained, her voice breaking slightly, then this wedding reception will be the ultimate test of his character. When the truth is projected on those screens and the police walk through those ballroom doors, he will be forced to make a choice. He will either stand in horror and support his victimized sister and his betrayed bride, or he will try to defend the monsters who raised him. If he knows about the fraud and has been quietly complicit all along, then he deserves to go down with the sinking ship in front of everyone he knows. If he does not know, this will force him to wake up from his pathetic suburban delusion. We cannot protect him from the truth anymore, Maya. We have to let the fire burn and see what is left standing in the ashes. I looked at Jasmine, this brilliant, fierce woman who had completely derailed her own perfect wedding to save a sister she barely knew. I felt a profound sense of awe and deep sisterhood. I nodded in absolute agreement. The vow of secrecy was sealed. We would say absolutely nothing. The countdown to the wedding day felt like a slow, agonizing march toward an inevitable execution. I went to work every single day pretending I was still the defeated, panicked daughter. I paid the minimal amount on the fraudulent credit card just to keep the bank algorithms quiet. I ignored the passive-aggressive text messages my mother occasionally sent reminding me of my excommunicated status. I let them bask in their false victory. I let them buy their expensive champagne and fit their tailored tuxedos. I let them believe they had successfully consumed my entire future without a single consequence. I sat in my small apartment listening to the hum of the laundromat and I waited. The trap was flawlessly set. The criminal evidence was entirely locked and loaded. And the sheer glorious anticipation of their impending public destruction was the only thing keeping my heart beating. I was completely ready to watch the Evans family empire burn to the ground. The heavy, suffocating silence of my 10-year-old rattling sedan was a stark contrast to the distant, joyful sounds echoing across the manicured lawns. I sat completely frozen in the driver's seat parked at the very edge of the sprawling Oakmont Country Club parking lot. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the rows of imported luxury vehicles that surrounded my cheap commuter car. For the past 2 hours, I had been sitting in the suffocating heat of my vehicle, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. I watched the golden afternoon light fade into a crisp, cool evening, entirely separated from the lavish celebration happening just a few hundred yards away. The outdoor garden ceremony had officially concluded. I could hear the faint, elegant strains of a live string quartet floating through the evening air, accompanied by the soft, sophisticated murmur of 200 wealthy guests. My parents had done it. They had successfully marched down the aisle playing the roles of the perfect, affluent suburban parents. They had smiled for the expensive professional photographers pretending they belonged in this world of generational wealth. They had absolutely no idea that their entire pristine illusion was resting on a live bomb with a rapidly ticking timer. Sitting in the dark, I allowed myself one final moment to reflect on the sheer agonizing torture of the past 3 weeks. Since the day Jasmine and I sat in that downtown law office and finalized our trap, I had been forced to play the most difficult psychological game of my entire life. I had to continue going to my grueling 60-hour-a-week job at the medical billing firm, acting as if my entire financial existence had not been completely obliterated. I had to silently transfer my hard-earned wages to pay the minimum balances on the fraudulent $40,000 credit card and the massive home equity line of credit. Every single dollar I sent to the bank felt like a physical knife twisting in my ribs. I did it solely to keep the automated banking algorithms from flagging the accounts and alerting my parents that something was wrong. I let Brenda and Richard bask in the arrogant delusion that they had won. I let them believe that their horrific threat of framing me for federal tax evasion had successfully cowed me into permanent, terrified submission. I let them buy their expensive champagne and rent their designer tuxedos using the very credit score I had spent a decade desperately trying to build. I swallowed my pride and my rage, and I waited in the dark. Through the slightly tinted windshield of my car, I watched the massive, heavy oak doors of the historic clubhouse swing open. The golden, warm light from the crystal chandeliers spilled out onto the cobblestone terrace. The cocktail hour was ending. The beautifully dressed guests were beginning their slow, elegant migration from the outdoor patio into the spectacular grand ballroom. I watched women in glittering evening gowns and men in impeccably tailored suits laughing and holding crystal champagne flutes. I knew Jasmine's family was mingling in that crowd, radiating quiet, genuine confidence. And I knew my parents were right there beside them, desperately, aggressively trying to match their effortless grace. I imagined my father Richard swirling a glass of expensive scotch, casually dropping hints to Jasmine's father about their fake real estate investment opportunity. I pictured my mother Brenda adjusting her fake designer jewelry, completely intoxicated by the social glory she had stolen my identity to purchase. They were standing at the absolute peak of their fake empire. They were higher than they had ever been in their entire pathetic lives, which meant the inevitable fall was going to be absolutely spectacular. Resting on the passenger seat beside me was the thick manila folder. It was no longer just a collection of terrifying banking errors. It was the physical manifestation of my vengeance. It contained the meticulously organized slides, the high-resolution scans of the forged signatures, the IP address tracking logs, and the undeniable audio transcripts. It was the exact ammunition Jasmine and her trusted audiovisual coordinator needed to completely hijack the massive digital projection screens inside that ballroom. I reached out and rested my trembling hand on the smooth paper of the folder. A strange, incredibly powerful sensation washed over my exhausted body. The crippling, suffocating panic that had dominated my life since I was a teenager simply evaporated. The terrified medical biller who lived in a windowless box above a noisy laundromat was completely gone. The daughter who desperately yearned for her mother's genuine affection no longer existed. They had killed that version of me the moment they decided my future was expendable. The woman sitting in the dark car was someone entirely new. I was a survivor who had finally learned how to fight back, and I was armed with the absolute devastating truth. The digital clock on my dashboard flipped to 7:30 in the evening. The transition to the grand ballroom was almost complete. The heavy oak doors of the clubhouse slowly swung shut, muffling the elegant music and the wealthy chatter. The parking lot grew incredibly still. The only sound was the harsh, ragged rhythm of my own breathing. The trap was fully set. The federal arrest warrants were quietly sitting in the hands of the plainclothes detectives who were currently waiting in unmarked vehicles just down the street. Everything was perfectly aligned. All that remained was the final signal. Suddenly, the dark interior of my car was illuminated by the harsh, bright glow of my cell phone screen. The device vibrated violently against the center console, shattering the heavy silence. I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribcage like a trapped bird. I reached down and picked up the phone, my fingers slightly numb. A single new text message notification floated on the lock screen. The sender was Jasmine. I unlocked the phone and opened the message. There were no pleasantries. There was no hesitation. The message was incredibly brief and ruthlessly precise. It read, "They are taking their seats. Come to the side entrance. Security is waiting to let you in." I stared at those 3 sentences, reading them over and over until the glowing letters burned into my retinas. This was it. The point of no return. There was no backing out, no second-guessing, no room for fear. Jasmine had played her part, flawlessly executing the wedding ceremony with the poised grace of a woman who knew she was about to burn the entire venue to the ground. She had navigated the vows, the photographs, and the family embraces while secretly holding the detonator in her hands. Now it was my turn to walk into the fire. I turned off the cell phone screen and slipped it into the pocket of my modest black dress. I did not bother checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. I did not care that my hair was slightly messy or that my clothes were visibly cheap compared to the designer gowns inside that ballroom. I was not there to impress anyone. I was there to deliver an execution. I picked up the heavy manila folder, gripping it tightly against my chest. I opened the car door and stepped out into the cool evening air. The sudden chill sent a sharp, awakening shiver down my spine. I closed the car door with a quiet, solid thud that echoed softly across the empty asphalt. I turned my back on my battered sedan and began to walk across the perfectly manicured lawns toward the side entrance of the historic clubhouse. The massive, glowing windows of the grand ballroom loomed ahead of me like a giant, glittering cage. I could see the silhouettes of the guests finding their assigned tables, completely unaware of the absolute destruction that was about to unfold. I approached the heavy wrought iron service gate. A large man in a dark suit stood perfectly still in the shadows. He looked at my face and then gave a single, silent, confirming nod. He reached out and opened the heavy gate. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the darkness and into the light. The security guard let me inside the dimly lit service corridor without a single word. I navigated the narrow back hallways of the historic Oakmont Country Club completely unseen by the wealthy arriving guests. The muffled sound of a live jazz band echoed through the thick stone walls. I climbed a steep, narrow spiral staircase that led directly up to the elevated audiovisual control booth suspended high above the grand ballroom. Jasmine's trusted tech specialist, a quiet, intense man named David, was already there, sitting in the dark in front of a massive bank of glowing monitors and sound mixing boards. He gave me a brief acknowledging nod and pointed to an empty space right beside the primary glass viewing window. I moved silently into the shadows and looked down at the spectacular scene unfolding directly below me. The sheer, staggering opulence of the grand ballroom hit me like a physical wave. It was an absolute masterpiece of extravagant wealth. Massive, multi-tiered crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over 200 impeccably dressed guests. The tables were draped in heavy imported silk linens and completely smothered in towering centerpieces of rare white orchids and cascading ivory roses. I recognized those specific floral arrangements immediately. They were the exact premium centerpieces listed on the maxed-out $40,000 credit card my mother had fraudulently opened in my name. In the very center of the room, commanding absolute attention, stood a magnificent 10-tier wedding cake adorned with delicate edible gold leaf. Flanking the massive cake were two intricately carved ice sculptures that caught the chandelier light and sparkled brilliantly like crushed diamonds. A premium open bar spanned the entire back wall, serving top-shelf liquor and imported French champagne. Waiters in crisp white tuxedo jackets circulated effortlessly, carrying silver trays loaded with gourmet hors d'oeuvres. Every single exquisite detail, every sparkling crystal glass, every perfectly folded napkin was entirely paid for by my stolen identity. They had literally harvested my financial soul to construct this breathtaking illusion. I pressed my hands against the cool glass of the viewing window, looking at the spectacular display of wealth, and felt a profound, sickening twist in my stomach. It was a beautiful, glittering monument built entirely on top of my destroyed future. My eyes scanned the crowded ballroom and immediately locked onto my mother. Brenda was absolutely in her element. She was wearing a stunning floor-length custom designer gown in a deep, rich sapphire blue. It was easily a $5,000 dress, and I wondered absently which of my hijacked credit lines she had used to pay for it. Her hair was professionally styled into an elegant updo, and she was dripping in sparkling jewelry. She was aggressively working the room, moving from table to table with a bright, practiced smile plastered across her face. She was completely intoxicated by the social glory. She had spent her entire miserable suburban life desperately craving this exact level of elite validation. I watched her glide over to a group of Jasmine's wealthy relatives. She threw her head back and let out that same light, dismissive laugh she had used when she mocked me in her kitchen just 3 weeks ago. She held her crystal champagne flute with a delicate grip, her posture radiating absolute, unearned superiority. She looked exactly like a seasoned aristocrat greeting her loyal subjects. She truly believed she belonged among these people. She truly believed she had successfully bought her way into high society, using the stolen credit of her deeply practical, deeply boring daughter. My father, Richard, was standing near the main bar, completely mirroring her arrogant performance. He was wearing an impeccably tailored custom tuxedo that hugged his shoulders perfectly, making him look significantly more distinguished than the failing broke mechanic he actually was. He had cornered a group of older gentlemen, and I instantly recognized Jasmine's father standing right in the center of the circle. Richard was leaning in casually, holding a tumbler of expensive aged scotch. He was smiling warmly, exuding the calm, confident energy of a highly successful commercial real estate tycoon. He was actively running the con. I could see him gesturing with his free hand, undoubtedly spinning his elaborate fabricated pitch about his highly lucrative downtown property flips. He was trying to extract $100,000 of clean investment cash from a family he was actively deceiving, while standing in a ballroom funded entirely by his daughter's stolen identity. The sheer magnitude of his psychopathic entitlement was absolutely staggering. He clinked his glass against Jasmine's father's glass, sealing some imaginary bond of mutual wealth and respect. I stood in the dark, silent audiovisual booth looking down at my parents as they danced their flawless, fraudulent waltz across the ballroom floor. They were entirely convinced that they had completely and permanently won. They believed their monstrous plan had been executed with absolute total perfection. In their greedy, delusional minds, I was currently sitting on the floor of my cramped, depressing apartment above the noisy laundromat, weeping uncontrollably and writing my letter of resignation out of pure terror. They honestly thought I was too broken, too terrified, and too pathetic to ever challenge their authority. They assumed the overwhelming threat of an Internal Revenue Service audit and federal prison time had successfully crushed my spirit into a million tiny pieces. They were celebrating my complete destruction. They were toasting to my financial demise. They looked so incredibly happy, so deeply satisfied with the beautiful, glittering lie they had manufactured. But as I watched Brenda kiss a wealthy aunt on the cheek and Richard slap a millionaire uncle on the back, I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I did not feel any lingering childhood longing for their love or their approval. I felt the cold, hard steel of pure, absolute justice waiting patiently in my hands. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom had been completely closed and guarded. The music was playing. The champagne was flowing. The trap had been perfectly, completely sealed. And I was standing right above them, holding the lit match that was going to burn their entire fake kingdom straight to the ground. The soft, elegant chime of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute cut sharply through the low murmur of the grand ballroom. Down on the main floor, the live string quartet immediately brought their music to a graceful halt. The 200 wealthy guests turned their attention toward the elevated stage at the far end of the room. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed audiovisual booth, pressing my hands flat against the cold glass of the viewing window. Beside me, David hovered his fingers over the glowing mixing board, completely ready for the signal. My father, Richard, stepped confidently up to the microphone. He adjusted the lapels of his custom designer tuxedo with a slow, practiced arrogance. That tuxedo was a masterpiece of tailoring, and it was paid for entirely by the massive, fraudulent credit line attached to my stolen Social Security number. He looked out over the sea of upturned faces, his chest puffed out with the sheer, absolute pride of a man who truly believed he had conquered the world. He smiled warmly, locking eyes with Jasmine's father, sitting at the premier VIP table right at the front of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, rich and dripping with fake aristocratic authority. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the union of two extraordinary young people. But we are also celebrating the merging of two great families. When Brenda and I first met Jasmine, we knew immediately that she was the perfect addition to the Evans family legacy. I felt a sickening surge of bile rise in the back of my throat. The Evans family legacy. It was a complete and utter fabrication. Their legacy consisted of a failing mechanic shop, secret high-interest credit cards, 10 years of hidden bankruptcy, and a terrifying willingness to financially destroy their own daughter to maintain a suburban illusion. But Richard delivered the lie with the absolute conviction of a seasoned psychopath. He genuinely believed his own performance. Building a lasting dynasty requires immense sacrifice and unwavering dedication. Richard continued, pacing slowly across the stage like a billionaire giving a keynote address. It requires the kind of generational wealth and steady financial foundation that allows our children to soar. As parents, our absolute greatest duty is to provide our children with the resources they need to build a spectacular life. That is exactly why Brenda and I were so incredibly proud to purchase a beautiful luxury home for Lucas and Jasmine to begin their new chapter. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his words hit me so hard, I actually had to brace myself against the wall of the booth. He was standing in front of the most powerful people in the city, boldly taking credit for the $180,000 home equity line of credit he had illegally opened by forging my signature. He was wearing a stolen suit, drinking stolen champagne, and basking in the applause for a stolen house. He was looking directly at Jasmine's wealthy real estate tycoon father and positioning himself as an equal. "Jasmine and her family understand the true value of smart investments," Richard said, raising his crystal flute toward her parents' table. "They understand that true wealth is not just about money. It is about the legacy you leave behind. It is about taking the right opportunities and knowing how to leverage your assets to secure your future." Brenda and I have spent our entire lives building our empire so that our golden boy Lucas would never have to struggle for a single day in his life. We look at Jasmine and we see a woman who matches our family values perfectly. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome her into our prestigious lineage. Every single word he spoke twisted the knife deeper. He stood there preaching about integrity and smart investments, while actively attempting to con Jasmine's father out of $100,000 for a fake downtown real estate flip. He spoke about leveraging assets when his only actual asset was my hijacked identity. The tension inside the dark audiovisual booth reached an absolute boiling point. I was breathing heavily, my fingernails biting painfully into the palms of my hands. I watched my mother Brenda sitting at the head table dabbing a perfectly dry eye with a lace handkerchief. She looked around the room, soaking in the admiring glances of the wealthy guests, completely intoxicated by her own massive deception. Lucas sat beside Jasmine's, beaming with oblivious pride, thoroughly convinced his parents were the magnificent, benevolent providers they claimed to be. They were all completely trapped in their own spectacular delusion. They honestly believed I was sitting alone in my dark apartment, completely broken and terrified by their threat of an Internal Revenue Service audit. They thought they had entirely silenced me. The absolute arrogance required to stand on a public stage and brag about a stolen house while the victim of your felony fraud was literally bleeding out in the dark was beyond human comprehension. Richard had absolutely no soul. Brenda had no conscience. They were empty, predatory shells wearing expensive clothes. To Lucas and Jasmine, Richard concluded, raising his glass high into the air, the stage lights catching the crystal and throwing glittering reflections across the ballroom. May your future be as bright and as prosperous as the incredible foundation your families have provided for you. Cheers. The grand ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. 200 guests rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically and raising their own glasses in tribute to the generous, wealthy patriarch of the Evans family. The sound was deafening, a roaring wave of validation that fed directly into my parents' bottomless greed. Richard beamed, bowing his head slightly as he descended the stage steps. Brenda stood up to embrace him, putting on a flawless display of elegant maternal pride. But as the heavy applause began to slowly die down and the guests started to take their seats, a sudden profound shift in the energy of the room occurred. The string quartet had lifted their bows, completely prepared to launch into a light, joyful melody to transition the evening into dinner. But the music never started. Jasmine did not sit down. She stood up from her chair at the center of the head table, her magnificent custom wedding gown flowing around her like a waterfall of white silk and intricate lace. Her movements were incredibly deliberate, completely devoid of the blushing modesty expected of a new bride. The entire ballroom fell into a sudden confused hush as they watched her walk smoothly toward the stage. She did not look at Lucas. She did not look at Brenda or Richard. Her dark eyes were entirely locked on the microphone stand. She stepped up onto the stage, gracefully taking the heavy microphone from its clip. The sudden sharp feedback whined through the speakers, causing a few guests in the front row to flinch. I held my breath in the darkened booth above my heart, hammering against my ribs with terrifying force. Jasmine stood center stage, looking out over the wealthy crowd, and then she looked directly up at the small dark window of the audiovisual booth where she knew I was watching. The illusion of grandeur was officially over. The execution was about to begin. I stood pressed against the cool glass of the audiovisual booth high above the grand ballroom, watching my own brother's wedding reception transform into a perfectly orchestrated execution. Jasmine stood at the absolute center of the massive elevated stage. She looked absolutely radiant. Her custom silk wedding gown pooled around her feet like liquid pearl, catching the warm golden light of the massive crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. The 200 wealthy guests settled into their plush chairs, their eyes fixed eagerly on the beautiful bride. They were fully expecting a sweet, sentimental speech. They were expecting the traditional gracious words of a woman who had just married into a respectable, wealthy suburban family. I held my breath, my hands gripping the cold metal edge of the mixing console, while David, the trusted technician beside me, kept his fingers hovering perfectly still over the master audio controls. Jasmine raised the microphone to her lips. Her voice echoed through the massive state-of-the-art speakers, warm and incredibly steady. She began exactly as a traditional bride should. She turned her body toward the premier VIP table at the very front of the room where her parents sat. She thanked her mother and father for their endless love and their unwavering support. She thanked them for funding the magnificent reception and for teaching her the true value of integrity and honesty from a very young age. The wealthy crowd let out a collective soft murmur of approval. My father Richard stood near the mahogany bar, nodding along as if he completely shared those exact same values of profound integrity. My mother, Brenda, sat at the head table beaming with unearned pride, utterly convinced that this beautiful, wealthy woman was officially their ultimate family prize. But then Jasmine stopped speaking. She let a heavy, deliberate silence fall over the massive ballroom. She lowered the microphone for just a fraction of a second, and when she brought it back up to her lips, the warm, blushing bride was completely gone. The woman standing on that stage was the ruthless corporate auditor who destroyed financial criminals for a living. Her polite smile vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of absolute chilling ice. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. "Marriage is about merging families," Jasmine said, her voice echoing with a new sharp edge that commanded absolute attention from every single person in the room. "It is about joining lives, sharing futures, and building a solid foundation on absolute trust. But above all else, marriage is about truth." I watched from the dark booth as the energy in the ballroom instantly shifted. The soft, polite murmurs died completely. Guests exchanged highly confused glances. At the head table, my brother Lucas blinked rapidly, his handsome face twisting into a mask of pure bewilderment. He leaned forward slightly, clearly not recognizing this fierce, uncompromising tone from his new wife. Beside him, my mother, Brenda, suddenly went completely rigid. Her posture stiffened and her manicured hands gripped the edge of the heavy silk tablecloth so tightly her knuckles turned pure white. She knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. Jasmine began to pace slowly across the wide stage, her heels clicking a steady, methodical rhythm against the polished wood. She looked out over the sea of faces, deliberately letting the tension build until the air felt thick enough to snap. And today she continued, her voice ringing out with terrifying clarity. "There is a very important member of our family missing from this table." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and deafening. You could hear a pin drop on the hardwood floor. Nobody dared to take a sip of their imported champagne. Nobody dared to whisper to the person sitting next to them. Jasmine stopped pacing and turned her body directly toward the head table. She did not look at her husband. She locked her blazing dark eyes entirely on my mother. She stared Brenda down with the predatory focus of a hawk circling its prey. "Brenda," Jasmine said, her voice amplifying through the speakers like a judge handing down a final sentence. "Why did you banish Maya from the venue today?" The direct question hit the room like a physical shockwave. It was completely blunt, utterly devastating, and explicitly specific. There was absolutely no room for misinterpretation or gentle evasion. Jasmine had taken the carefully constructed, glittering facade of the Evans family and smashed it with a single, merciless swing of a hammer. I gasped in the dark of the audiovisual booth, feeling a sudden massive surge of adrenaline rush through my veins. She had actually done it. She had pulled the pin on the grenade in front of 200 of the most powerful people in the city. Down on the ballroom floor, the reaction was instantaneous and completely chaotic. A collective gasp rippled through the tables of Jasmine's wealthy relatives. My father Richard nearly dropped his expensive tumbler of scotch, his face draining of all color until he looked like a gray ghost. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into the mahogany bar. But it was my mother, Brenda, who provided the most spectacular display of absolute panic. Brenda sat frozen at the head table, looking exactly like an animal caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish gasping for oxygen. Her perfect aristocratic performance completely collapsed into a pathetic display of pure visceral terror. She looked wildly around the room, seeing hundreds of wealthy elite guests staring directly at her, waiting for an explanation. She desperately tried to salvage the situation, to patch the gaping hole in her rapidly sinking ship. She frantically grabbed the table microphone sitting in front of Lucas. She forced a high-pitched, hysterical laugh that echoed horribly through the silent room. "Oh, Jasmine, sweetheart," Brenda stammered, her voice trembling so violently it cracked on the speakers. "This is just a tiny, silly misunderstanding." Maya was feeling terribly unwell today. She caught a horrible stomach bug and insisted on staying home so she would not ruin your beautiful day. You know how incredibly dramatic my daughter can be. She just wanted attention. Brenda attempted another forced airy laugh, but it died instantly in her dry throat. She looked around, pleading for validation, begging the crowd to accept her desperate, frantic lie. She smiled her signature fake smile, hoping her country club charm would save her from the sudden, unbearable scrutiny. But the crowd gave her absolutely nothing. The grand ballroom fell dead silent once again. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on the room like a physical weight. The cheerful clinking of crystal glasses had stopped entirely. The professional waitstaff stood frozen against the walls, holding silver trays of gourmet food they were too terrified to serve. The wealthy guests, the real estate tycoons, the corporate lawyers, the socialites. They all stared at Brenda with cold, unforgiving, judging eyes. They were completely seasoned in the art of reading people, and they knew instantly that they were watching a woman drowning in her own toxic deception. The glittering illusion of the wealthy, prestigious Evans family was unraveling in real time right in front of their eyes, and Brenda was completely powerless to stop it. Jasmine stood at the absolute center of the massive elevated stage, holding the microphone with total, unwavering authority. She looked absolutely radiant in her flowing custom silk wedding gown, but her dark eyes were blazing with a fierce, calculating intensity. She looked right up at the glass window of the audiovisual booth and spoke my name. Maya, she said, her voice echoing clearly and powerfully across the dead silent ballroom. It is time for you to come down here. You do not have to hide in the shadows of this family anymore. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline course completely through my veins. I turned to David, the trusted technician sitting beside me in the dark. He gave me a single solid confirming nod, his hands hovering directly over the master control boards. I opened the heavy soundproof door of the booth and stepped out into the quiet carpeted hallway. I walked toward the sweeping grand staircase that curved gracefully down into the main ballroom. With every single step I took down those plush carpeted stairs, I felt 10 years of suffocating, crushing fear completely peeling away from my soul. I was no longer the frightened little girl who stayed up late paying my parents past due bills. I was no longer the invisible, disposable daughter they could casually discard and financially destroy. I walked down the curved staircase and the entire room slowly turned to watch me. 200 wealthy elite guests dressed in their absolute best evening wear stared at my cheap black dress and my pale, determined face. I kept my chin high and my shoulders pulled back. I walked straight toward the head table where my mother Brenda was currently clutching her chest, her face a twisted mask of absolute terrified comprehension. I stopped right at the edge of the stage, standing perfectly aligned with Jasmine. We were an entirely united front. Jasmine looked down at me and gave a small, reassuring smile. Then she turned her attention back to the massive crowd. She raised her free hand and gave a sharp, deliberate signal directly toward the audiovisual booth high above us. Instantly, the warm, romantic ambient lighting in the grand ballroom was completely cut off. The room plunged into a sudden, dramatic, heavy darkness. A loud collective gasp rippled through the sea of wealthy guests. A second later, the massive high-definition projection screens positioned directly behind the bridal party roared to life with a blinding white light. These were the giant, expensive screens supposedly reserved for a beautiful, touching, romantic photo montage of the happy couple's childhood memories and their scenic vacations. Instead, the bright, stark light of high-resolution, scanned legal documents flooded the entire ballroom. The visual impact was absolutely staggering. Their projected 20 feet high for every single person to see was the finalized home equity line of credit. The giant bold letters of the bank header blared across the massive screens. Right below it, highlighted in bright fluorescent yellow, was the total loan amount of $180,000. And right at the very bottom of the page, magnified for absolute unavoidable clarity, was my forged signature perfectly traced and executed by my own mother. The screen shifted with a loud digital click echoing heavily through the state-of-the-art sound system. The next image flashed before the stunned crowd. It was the heavily redacted but entirely unmistakable police affidavit issued by the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The heavy black text outlined the exact criminal charges of grand larceny, wire fraud, and felony identity theft. David was operating the controls upstairs with the precision of a seasoned federal prosecutor presenting a master case to a grand jury. He zoomed in closely on the IP address logs, proving without a single shadow of a doubt that the fraudulent digital applications had originated directly from the router inside my father's suburban home office. Then the screen shifted again. This time it displayed the official corporate registry documents for Evans' legacy events. It showed the exact bank routing numbers permanently linking the fake limited liability company to the massive catering deposits made for this very wedding reception. The sheer, undeniable weight of the criminal evidence loomed over the entire room, casting a harsh, blinding white glow over my parents' completely horrified faces. Jasmine lifted the microphone back to her lips. Her voice cut through the stunned, paralyzed silence like a sharpened steel blade. "Marriage is about merging families," Jasmine said, her tone completely devoid of any bridal warmth. "It is about joining lives, sharing futures, and building a solid foundation on absolute trust. But above all else, marriage is about truth. What you are looking at right now on these screens is the true, genuine legacy of the Evans family. You are looking at the exact rotting foundation of this beautiful, glamorous reception." The wealthy crowd sat completely mesmerized, unable to tear their eyes away from the massive projections. Brenda and Richard Evans did not pay for these spectacular crystal chandeliers. Jasmine continued, her voice rising with fierce, protective anger. They did not pay for the imported silk table linens or the 10-tier wedding cake or the vintage French champagne you are currently drinking. They funded this entire lavish affair by committing felony identity theft against their own daughter. The sound that moved through the grand ballroom was incredibly visceral. It was a massive physical wave of collective shock. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths with manicured hands in absolute horror. Corporate executives leaned forward in their chairs, squinting at the massive projection screens reading the highlighted federal felony charges. Jasmine did not stop. She paced slowly across the stage, making absolutely certain her words reached the very back of the massive, opulent room. For the past 10 years, Maya has quietly sacrificed her own life to keep this pathetic family afloat, Jasmine declared, her voice booming through the speakers. She worked 60-hour weeks to pay their suburban mortgage while they treated her like an absolute burden. And when they needed a massive injection of cash to fund a wedding that would elevate their fake social status, they did not hesitate to completely obliterate her financial future. They stole her social security number. They forged her signature. They took out a $180,000 fraudulent loan, and then they explicitly threatened to frame her for tax evasion if she dared to go to the police. They believed their precious public country club image was entirely untouchable. They believed they could simply discard her in the dark and step right into the brilliant spotlight. Jasmine stopped pacing and looked directly at the premier VIP table where her own family sat. But their incredible bottomless greed did not stop at destroying their own daughter, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling whisper that commanded the entire room. They saw my family not as a joining of lives, but as a massive, unlimited cash machine. She turned abruptly and pointed a fierce, accusing finger directly at my father, Richard. He flinched violently, shrinking back against his chair like a cornered, terrified rat. 3 days ago, Jasmine announced Richard Evans sat down with my father at a private country club lunch. He presented my father with a beautifully printed brochure for a highly lucrative downtown commercial real estate development. He offered my father a ground floor opportunity to partner with the Evans family on a multi-million-dollar flip. He asked for a $100,000 good faith wire transfer to secure the deal. Jasmine signaled the booth one more time. The massive screens behind us instantly flashed a high-definition scan of the glossy investment brochure my father had used for his pitch. Right beside it, David brought up the banking details for the holding account Richard had instructed Jasmine's father to use. The screens explicitly showed that the holding account was actually registered to Evans Legacy Events. It was the exact same fake money laundering shell company they had created using my stolen identity to fund the wedding. Richard Evans was not offering my family a real estate partnership, Jasmine declared, her voice booming with absolute righteous fury. He was running a calculated, desperate scam to extract $100,000 in clean cash from my father. He planned to use that stolen money to pay the minimum balances on Maya's fraudulent loans just long enough to keep the federal investigators away, while pocketing the rest to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. He was perfectly willing to defraud the family of his future daughter-in-law on the very week of the wedding. The reaction from this crowd was absolutely deafening. The polite, hushed whispers had completely dissolved into loud, angry murmurs and gasps of pure revulsion. People were actively pointing at the stage, pointing at the screens, and pointing directly at my parents. The pristine, glittering bubble of high society had completely shattered, exposing the rotting, grotesque truth beneath. I watched my mother, Brenda, desperately trying to hide her face behind her trembling hands, her chest heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. The elegant, confident matriarch from 10 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, exposed criminal who finally realized there was absolutely no escape. At the premier VIP table, Jasmine's father slowly pushed his chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor, echoing through the tense room. He stood up, his massive, imposing frame towering over the elegant table. His face was dark with an incredibly terrifying, silent fury. He was a brilliant man who had built a corporate empire from the ground up, and he absolutely did not tolerate being played for a fool. He glared at Richard with a look of such profound, absolute contempt that my father actually raised his hands in a pathetic, weak, defensive gesture. A second later, Jasmine's mother stood up right beside him. Her face was set in a mask of total, unadulterated disgust. One by one, every single member of Jasmine's extended family rose from their seats. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and corporate colleagues all stood up in total, unified solidarity, rejecting the Evans family completely and entirely. They stood there in their expensive evening wear, staring down at the pathetic, shivering criminals sitting at the head table. The public execution was absolute. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom did not last long. The sheer weight of the projected evidence hung over the crowd for a few agonizing seconds before the reality of the situation fully registered. Then the chaos completely erupted. Down at the head table, my mother Brenda suddenly shattered the quiet with a sharp, hysterical scream. Her perfectly constructed aristocratic mask dissolved into a frantic, desperate rage. She jumped up from her chair, knocking her crystal champagne flute onto the polished hardwood floor where it shattered into a dozen glittering pieces. She pointed a trembling finger at the massive projection screens and screamed at the top of her lungs that it was all a lie. She yelled to the horrified guests that the documents were fake, that I was a jealous, vindictive daughter trying to ruin my brother's beautiful day. She hitched up the heavy silk skirt of her expensive sapphire gown and actually lunged toward the stage as if she could physically tear the digital images out of the air. She looked completely unhinged, thrashing her arms and demanding that someone turn the projectors off immediately. My father Richard did not move to stop her. He sat completely paralyzed in his chair, his face a sickly pale gray, sweating profusely inside his custom-tailored tuxedo. He knew it was over. He knew the paper trail was absolutely flawless and that every single word Jasmine had spoken was the absolute truth. Brenda kept screaming, her voice turning hoarse and wild, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the historic venue as the wealthy attendees backed away from her in pure disgust. But Brenda's hysterical performance was abruptly cut short. From the very back of the spectacular ballroom, the massive, heavy mahogany doors swung open with a loud, definitive thud that commanded the entire room's attention. The elegant, uniformed waitstaff quickly scattered out of the way. Marching straight down the center aisle, stepping deliberately over the scattered rose petals from the ceremony, was a line of local police officers. Leading them was the exact same hardened senior detective from the Financial Crimes Division that Jasmine and I had met with just a few days ago. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He wore a sharp, dark suit and he held a thick stack of official paperwork in his hand. The contrast between the glittering crystal chandeliers, the delicate ice sculptures, the towering 10-tier wedding cake, and the stern, imposing presence of law enforcement was incredibly stark. The detective did not hesitate. He walked directly past the tables of stunned, silent guests, straight toward the head table where my parents were standing. He raised his voice, projecting a tone of absolute, unquestionable authority that easily overpowered Brenda's panicked sobbing. He formally announced that he possessed active federal arrest warrants for Richard and Brenda Evans. He explicitly listed the charges out loud for every single one of the 200 elite guests to hear. Grand larceny, wire fraud, felony identity theft, and money laundering. He stated clearly that they were being placed under arrest for the theft of $180,000. The visceral satisfaction of that exact moment was something I will remember for the rest of my entire life. I stood on the edge of the grand staircase watching as two uniformed officers moved swiftly around the lavishly decorated head table. They grabbed my father's arms, pulling them firmly behind his back. Richard offered absolutely no resistance. His shoulders slumped in total defeat and the pristine fabric of his incredibly expensive custom tuxedo bunched up awkwardly as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. He looked so incredibly small, so utterly pathetic standing there in his stolen finery. Brenda, however, fought back with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. She tried to pull away from the female officer who approached her, screaming that she was a respectable woman, that this was a massive misunderstanding, and that they were ruining a luxury wedding. The officer was completely unfazed. She grabbed Brenda's wrists and forced them firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic clink of the handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly over the sound of Brenda's expensive diamond bracelets rattling together. The detective stood directly in front of them and began reading them their Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice. "You have the right to remain silent," he recited. As the wealthy crowd watched the suburban royalty get treated exactly like the common criminals they truly were. Every single syllable of those rights felt like a soothing balm to my completely exhausted soul. They were standing in the middle of their ultimate social triumph, draped in stolen luxury, being publicly stripped of their freedom and their dignity. As my parents were being firmly guided away from the beautifully decorated table, my eyes shifted to the one person who had remained completely silent through the entire ordeal. Lucas. My golden boy brother stood frozen beside his overturned chair. He slowly turned his head to look up at the massive glowing projection screens, staring at the high-definition scans of the forged bank loans that had secretly purchased his perfect luxury starter home. He read the police affidavit confirming that his own mother and father had financially destroyed his sister to fund his lavish lifestyle. Then he turned his head and looked up at me standing on the stairs. I did not look away. I held his gaze completely steady, letting him see the total, unvarnished truth. The heavy protective bubble of his perfect, pampered childhood had just been violently shattered. He finally realized that his entire life, his pristine house, this extravagant 10-tier cake, this beautiful, glittering reception was built entirely on the crushed bones of my future. He looked back at our parents as the police escorted them down the center aisle. Brenda twisted her head around, tears streaming down her face. She screamed his name, begging him to do something, begging him to call a lawyer to fix this catastrophic mess. Lucas simply stood there, the color completely drained from his handsome face. He raised his hands to his face and broke down into raw, heaving sobs. He did not step forward to help them. He did not try to defend them. He slowly turned his back to Brenda and Richard, completely ignoring his mother's frantic, desperate cries. In that incredible defining moment, he finally saw them exactly as I had seen them for the past 10 years. He finally saw them for the calculated, ruthless monsters they truly were. It has been exactly 3 months since that spectacular, unforgettable night at the Oakmont Country Club. The swift and merciless hand of the federal justice system moved faster than my parents could ever have possibly anticipated. Brenda and Richard are currently sitting in separate federal holding facilities, entirely stripped of their designer clothes and their fake country club prestige. They are desperately awaiting their federal trial for grand larceny, wire fraud, felony identity theft, and money laundering. There were no high-powered defense attorneys rushing to their immediate aid. There were no wealthy, influential friends offering to post their massive bail. The moment the spectacular depth of their financial depravity was violently exposed to the public, every single person in their elite social circle completely severed all ties. They were entirely abandoned by the very society they had sacrificed my entire life to impress. My mother's frantic phone calls from the precinct went completely unanswered. My father's desperate pleas for leniency were met with absolute silence. The federal prosecutors, alongside Marcus Vance, meticulously unraveled every single fraudulent document, tracing every stolen dollar directly back to their greedy hands. Because the massive financial theft was officially reported, heavily investigated, and irrefutably proven with federal criminal convictions pending, the banking institutions had no choice but to completely void the enormous debt that had been maliciously chained to my name. The $180,000 home equity line of credit and the maxed-out $40,000 signature card were entirely wiped from my financial record. The bank then immediately turned their aggressive legal focus directly onto my parents' remaining assets. The sprawling suburban mansion that my mother Brenda had prized above her own daughter's life went into immediate aggressive foreclosure. The bank seized the estate, locking the doors and freezing all of their hidden secondary accounts. They liquidated whatever pathetic fragments of wealth my parents had left. They lost absolutely everything. Their home, their fake social standing, and their freedom were completely obliterated in a matter of weeks. The magnificent illusion they had built on my back was permanently reduced to absolute rubble. But perhaps the most profound consequence of that night was the incredible transformation of my brother Lucas. When the massive projection screens lit up the ballroom with the undeniable proof of his parents' monstrous crimes, Lucas did not rush to their defense. He did not let toxic family loyalty blind him to the horrific truth. His entire golden boy illusion was violently shattered in that ballroom, and the absolute devastation he felt was entirely genuine. In the days that followed the disastrous reception, Lucas sat on the floor of Jasmine's downtown apartment and finally confronted the terrifying reality of his privileged childhood. He wept for hours as he realized that his perfect life, his expensive clothes, and his beautiful starter home were entirely funded by the systematic financial and emotional abuse of his older sister. He completely turned his back on Brenda and Richard. He refused to visit them in holding, and he refused to answer the frantic, desperate letters my mother tried to send him from her cell. He finally saw them for the calculated, ruthless predators they truly were. Lucas and Jasmine made the immediate legal decision to completely annul the lavish, fraudulent wedding. They could not bear the thought of their marriage being forever tainted by my parents' massive deception. Exactly 1 month later, they eloped quietly in a small downtown courthouse. There were no 10-tier cakes, no ice sculptures, and no crystal chandeliers. It was just the two of them, a legal officiant, and me standing right beside them as their sole witness. It was simple, honest, and incredibly beautiful. Lucas is now in intensive therapy, working incredibly hard every single week to completely unlearn a lifetime of severe emotional manipulation and toxic entitlement. He is finally learning how to be a real brother, and we are slowly, carefully building a genuine relationship from the absolute ground up. As for me, the absolute crushing weight that had suffocated me for 10 agonizing years is completely gone. I remember the exact moment I fully realized I was finally free. It was a crisp, bright Tuesday morning, and I was walking into my brand new apartment. It is not a massive luxury estate or a glamorous downtown penthouse. It is a modest, beautifully sunlit one-bedroom apartment in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood far away from the toxic suburban nightmares of my past. But as I turned the key in the lock and pushed the heavy wooden door open, The sheer profound peace of the empty space brought hot tears of pure, absolute joy to my eyes. There is no noisy laundromat vibrating beneath my floorboards. There are no frantic, terrifying phone calls from collection agencies demanding thousands of dollars I do not have. There are no vicious, manipulative text messages from a mother demanding I sacrifice my entire existence to fund her delusions of grandeur. I walked into the middle of my small living room, dropped my keys on the counter, and I finally took a deep, full breath of clean, unburdened air. My credit score has been completely restored, reflecting the actual, responsible, hardworking life I have always lived. The terrifying red numbers on my banking app have been replaced by a beautiful, steady calm. I no longer work brutal 60-hour weeks at the medical billing office just to drown in fraudulent minimum payments. I cut my schedule down to a normal, healthy 40 hours. I actually have free time now. I spend my weekends browsing local farmers markets, reading thick books by the large bay window, drinking hot coffee, and simply existing without the constant, paralyzing fear of impending financial ruin. The chronic, painful anxiety that had lived inside my chest like a tightly coiled spring, a physical ache I carried every single day, has completely vanished. For the first time in my entire adult life, my shoulders are relaxed, and I am sleeping soundly through the night. The frightened, invisible scapegoat who desperately craved the hollow validation of her abusers is gone forever. I look around this beautiful, quiet apartment, watching the afternoon sunlight dance across the walls, and I know with absolute certainty that I built this safety with my own two hands. I am no longer a disposable pawn in their destructive, narcissistic game. I am the sole architect of my own incredibly beautiful and entirely peaceful life. If you are listening to this right now and you are trapped in the dark, suffocating shadow of a family that only values you for what they can extract from you, please listen to me very carefully. Family is supposed to be your safe harbor, not the terrifying storm that constantly drowns you. Setting firm, absolute boundaries with the people who brought you into this world is not a betrayal. It is a fundamental act of pure survival. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. You have the absolute right to walk away from anyone who actively destroys your peace, no matter who they are or what they claim you owe them. Your life belongs to you and no one else. If you are watching this and my story resonated with your own personal experiences, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to expose a toxic family member's lies to protect your own life and your own sanity? How did you finally take your power back from the people who tried to break you? Please drop your story down in the comments below, because I read every single one of them, and we all desperately need to know that we are not fighting these massive battles alone. Do not forget to let me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Always remember that your fundamental worth as a human being is absolutely not determined by how much you can be used by others. You deserve to be safe, you deserve to be respected, and you deserve to live a life that is entirely yours. Stay incredibly strong, keep fighting for your peace, and I will see you in the next story.